Azarok Sector, Achilles System. 745.M32. The room where Garion Drakencraft's underlings gathered had been a ballroom once. It was located in one of the wings of House Kernagreek's damaged spire, far above the pollution clouds that covered much of the planet, even after most of its industry had fallen to ruin. There, for generations, the high and mighty lords of Achilles had danced and laughed and feasted on delicacies that each cost a month of their workers' wages. Now it was in ruin, but it still served as a vast open space with little cover for assassins. The broken furniture had been cleared away, leaving those present to stand in a loose half-circle while Garion towered over them from the balcony. The assembly was divided in 3 groups, each centered around a leader who answered only to Garion himself. Each of them might have been a lord of their own, but instead, for various reasons, they had joined their fates to that of the demon prince. Outside, amidst the spires of Achilles, there raged a war of monsters. The pretense of civility to which the houses had clung right after the rebellion had completely fallen apart in the wake of the Truthful Gate's destruction. Without the Unfettered's presence hanging over them, those who had been transformed by his ministrations had turned on one another in open warfare with distressing rapidity. With no obvious culprit to blame for the destruction of the laboratory ship, accusations of treachery had flown back and forth, and paranoid leaders had launched preemptive assaults on the holdings of rivals. The Hive World's industry had slowed to a crawl as the war between the houses loyal to the Unfettered's greatest creation and those who sought to rule on their own spread across the world. Millions who had survived the uprising and the rule of the houses had perished, starving in their homes as supply lines collapsed. Millions more had died on the field of battle, press-ganged into service by the inhuman monsters who ruled over them and made to fight into a war whose motives and purpose they had no comprehension of. Garion would have preferred if the tenuous order had survived. It would have made his work easier if he didn't have to deal with the business of the ongoing war. He supposed that he could have come forward and revealed the truth of what had happened to the houses, told them the identity of the Unfettered's killer. But he didn't think they would have taken the revelation that the dark gods themselves had opposed the Unfettered's work well. At the very least, they would have tried to banish him, regarding him as a rival to their own power. Their intolerance of demons, instilled into them by the Unfettered, was now proving an obstacle rather than an asset. He had tried, at first, to drag his benefactor's soul from the warp, that he might learn the secrets of transfiguration directly from this shade, and perhaps even restore him to life. But all his attempts had ended in failure. He did not know if this was because the ruinous powers were even now opposing his goal, or because of some bargain the dead Fleshmaster had entered into during his life. Either was possible, but he did not know enough about his former lord's past to do anything other than speculate. Regardless, without the Chosen of Archon's ghost to interrogate, he had been forced to start from scratch, with only his own memories of the procedures he had undergone to use. This might have sounded easy, after all, he only needed to replicate what had already happened to him. But for one thing, he didn't doubt that the process needed to be adjusted to every soul, in order to take into account its unique quirks. For another, his memories of the weeks preceding his ascension were confused at best, and outright missing at worst. The Unfettered had inflicted unspeakable torments upon Garion, slowly stripping him of his humanity and replacing it with the power of the Empyrean. Even now, it was an effort to remember those days and nights without flinching away. Not that he begrudged the Unfettered this, the Fleshmaster had been very clear as to the risks and prices involved, and Garion had volunteered anyway. His body had been failing, even with the help of the Fleshmaster's enhancements, as the consequences of decades of practicing sorcery finally caught up with him. This had been his last chance to grasp true, real power, and it had worked beyond his wildest imagining. Garion owed it to the Unfettered to finish his work, and bring the secrets of transfiguration to the rest of the Forsaken Sons. He was also acutely aware that this secret was his only chance of assuaging the Awakened One's wrath. The stockpiles of food and material that had been meant for the Forsaken Sons' Black Crusade had swiftly been expended as the conflict escalated. When the Forsaken Sons returned, they would be disappointed by what had transpired in their absence. Despite his ascension, Garion was under no illusion as to how a confrontation between him and the Awakened One would end. One-on-one, he might have a chance. But Archon was not alone, and the sorcerers under his command would rend Garion's immortal existence asunder, which wasn't how he wanted to spend eternity. He was making progress. Painstakingly, He was rebuilding the law through which the Unfettered had transformed him. Every broken soul he experimented upon was one more step toward that goal, and there were plenty of subjects for him to use on Achilles. But he needed more time, more resources. He needed to have a space where he could work on reconstructing the Unfettered's work without being disturbed, as well as access to the resources of the houses in order to get his hands on the more esoteric ritual components he required. If he could have done otherwise, he would have left the houses to kill each other while hiding in some remote hole and scrabbling the reconstructed empiric equations onto the walls. Unfortunately, mere stone could not contain the knowledge he sought to recreate. It melted down after the first few symbols. Only powerful cogitators, protected with sorcerer swords, could hold on to the Unfettered's research into clawing transfiguration from the greedy hands of the gods. In order to have those, along with the sacrifices he needed to test his theories, Garion needed a power base. Which also meant that he had to look after it. Thankfully, he was familiar with the task of managing wildly clashing followers of the Pantheon after his time as the betrayer of Elder. Admittedly, the Scions of Achilles' houses were mightier than the mutant chieftains and mad cultists he had dealt with in his old domain. But he too was much more than he had been then, and he needed them if he was to accomplish his goals. And so he had built this little kingdom among the ashes of Achilles. After clawing his way out of the wreck of the Truthful Gate, destroyed during his confrontation with his god-sent assassin, Garion had swiftly gathered a following among the shocked denizens of the Hive. By luck or the designs of the powers, the ship had crashed into Hive Herringrad, and Garion had been able to take over the resources of House Greek, deprived of its leadership by Alaric's hunt of the Unfettered. The fact that many other monsters created by the Unfettered's early experiments had survived the crash of the Truthful Gate and had spread across Herringrad had helped in that regard. The patronage of the Unfettered's greatest creation had been one of the best protections the weakened house could hope. It was the quest for strength that had driven the houses to betray the Imperium, and it was strength that they respected above all else. Houses Lorenos and Taroden, long-term vassals of the Greek, had been added to his servants, and he had begun the work of making the broken spire of House Greek into a suitable place for his research. He had personally led assaults on the long-time rivals of House Greek, the Ogontrias, and wiped them out in a short and brutal campaign that had demonstrated his power beyond a doubt to his followers. Garion's demonic body was strong. He was taller than the tallest space marine, with hands that ended in claws that could cut through ceramite, and he could toss around ground cars like they were made of wool. But it was his knowledge of the arcane that made him truly powerful. For decades, he had learned to manipulate the energies of the warp as a frail mortal. Now these same energies were what his incarnate form was made of. His mastery of sorcery far outstripped that of any of Achilles' magi, and it had greatly aided him in building his growing empire. He had ripped apart several Ogontrias with his mind, tearing their souls from their bodies before hurling them into the jaws of the Neverborn that still massed on the other side of the veil. Despite the renewed warfare, Achilles still teetered on the brink of a full-scale demonic incursion that would have transformed it into a demon world. Garion had toyed with the idea of precipitating that transformation, but had eventually decided against it. He needed the human population for his research, and the sundering of the veil would have decreased it dramatically. With the raw power of the Empyrean held at bay, Garion had ordered small temples built across his territory, where priests conducted ceremonies and sacrifices in his name, sustaining his presence in the Materium. They had been dragged from the Hive, away from their congregations, and brought before Garion, who had revealed to them a portion of his own infernal revelations. Not all had accepted his message. Those who had not, he had killed, while sparing those who had abandoned their worship of the dark gods and focused their devotion on him. For all that had taken place upon the Hive world, Achilles was no demon world, and Garion required these measures to remain corporeal. Despite his initial bluster when facing Alaric, he still very much feared the prospect of dissolution. The dark gods may have failed to prevent his ascension, but he would rather not give them the opportunity to drag his spirit into their respective domains. Thanks to the Unfettered's ministrations, Garion had become a demon prince without the blessing of any of the ruinous powers, and the Chosen of Archon had discussed at length with him just how the Pantheon might react to this usurpation. As far as they knew, never before had an unaligned demon prince existed. The manufactoriums of Herringrad had been secured, along with the machines that produced a foul sustenance for the masses. Contact had been established with the mining tribes to secure a continued supply of raw material. Patrols had been sent out to secure the controlled zones from the monsters that roamed the ruins. Something like peace had descended upon Herringrad, and Garion had returned to his work. And then, only a few days after the fall of House Oguntrias, the attacks had started. Garion had hoped that, by quickly asserting his authority and power, he would have been able to pursue his research in peace. But the other houses had sent troops to Herringrad, making camp in abandoned districts and expanding outwards. Thankfully, they hadn't acted with any kind of unity, attacking each other as often as they did Garion's forces, all of them hoping to capture Herringrad for themselves. After a few weeks, the situation had more or less stabilized, with each house holding on to what it had captured and sending scouts to probe for weaknesses. Garion was quite content with that status quo, but he needed to make sure that it would last long enough, which was why he had called his lieutenants, in order to be certain all of them were doing their job. The aberrant demon prince looked at each of them in turn, letting his gaze linger just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Garion's 4 burning eyes had been known to utterly drive people mad or senseless on occasion, but his lieutenants were made of sterner stuff. The most obviously powerful among them was Raksha Black-Clawed, clad in the black and gold power armor of the Forsaken Sons, whose arm made of blades shone in the light of the sun passing through the broken windows. He and the 7 other Chaos Marines who had survived the crash were the leaders of Garion's armed forces, from the defenders of his fortress to the hunting parties sent to search the unreclaimed zones for scouts and wandering monsters. Their presence at his side had done a lot to ensure the loyalty of Herringrad's houses, for even now, the renegade Astartes were regarded with semi-worship by those who had traded their humanity for power. As for why Raksha and his pack had willingly put themselves under Garion's authority, the Forsaken Sons reckoned that siding with the Demon Prince was their best chance to salvage something of worth from the situation on Achilles. No message had been sent after the Truthful Gate's destruction to warn the rest of the Black Crusade of what had happened. The means to do so had been lost along with the ship. But the 8 Forsaken Sons didn't doubt that their lord would return, and they needed to earn the Awakened One's forgiveness for the death of the Chosen they had been tasked to guard. Helping Garion recreate the secrets of demonhood would achieve that. Raksha had come to the meeting accompanied by 2 of his brothers, with no mortal attendants. They stood between the other 2 groups, who gave them a wide berth. On Garion's left was the flock of Ishbal Kernagreek, the man he had chosen to lead the congregations whose rituals and sacrifices anchored his presence on Achilles. Ishbal himself was sat in a wheelchair that was pushed around by a blind hooded cultist. When Garion had first come to the Kernagreek spire, Ishbal had tried to resist him. Garion had broken his legs and his mind, before putting the latter back together in a shape that was more useful to him. Now Ishbal was fanatically loyal to the Demon Prince, seeing him as the pinnacle of strength that the houses had pursued for generations. Besides the servant that pushed his wheelchair around, Ishbal had come with half a dozen scribes to note every word spoken by the dark god he worshipped, and a trio of hulking bodyguards whose cult robes hid an arsenal of weapons. Finally, to Garion's right, was the being whose name was hated by hundreds of thousands across Herringrad. Nrekul Tarodin was responsible for the continued work in the factories, as well as keeping the remaining human population of Herringrad under control. As the effective head of House Tarodin, Nrekul showed the full potential of that house's mutations. Of all the houses of Achilles that had accepted the Unfettered's bargain, House Tarodin's alterations were among the most obvious. Before the unveiling of their true loyalty, they had been the ones who had struggled most to keep their secrets. The Scions of Tarodin were tall, heavily muscled humanoid, nothing that couldn't be explained by good breeding and vat-grown muscles. A strange affectation among the idle nobility to be sure, but not one that couldn't be explained as a simple eccentricity. But their skin was chalk white, their eyes scarlet, and, more difficult of all to conceal, they all had horns. Big, black horns, jutting out of their foreheads like devils of antiquity. The Unfettered had either been bored or tired when he had come up with the design for their transformation, but the Tarodin had never complained. Their bloodline had been one of the most heavily affected by the War of the Beast, with only a handful of children surviving the carnage wrought by the orcs, and the raw, uncomplicated strength they had received had been exactly what they had wanted. They had used surgery to remove their horns when they got too big, and used a combination of wigs and head coverings to keep them hidden otherwise. Their strange colorations had been managed with powders and tinted eye lenses. The last of their gifts, however, had not been nearly so easy to conceal. The older the children of House Tarodin got, the bigger they became. In the years leading up to the uprising, The house had been forced to resort to body doubles to hide their mutations, and they had been among the most fervent supporters of the rebellion, throwing their full might into the destruction of imperial authority on Achilles. As a result, they had suffered great losses in the brief civil war, and been forced to become vassals of House Kernagreek in order to survive in the new order. Nrekul was over 3 meters tall, a veritable mountain of muscles and lethality. A great axe hung from his back. Garion himself had gifted it to him, having engraved it with sigils of power. It was the weapon with which Nrekul executed all dissenters and would-be rebels within Heringrad. 3 of his kinsmen accompanied him, the tallest of whom only barely reached his shoulders, along with a single, terrified-looking slave carrying a bunch of reports. "Welcome, all of you," he said at last. "Now, let us not waste any more time." None of them mentioned that he had been the one looming over them for the last 5 minutes. "Raksha, your report, please." "The other houses have been quiet for the last 3 days," began the Forsaken Son. Since that business on the Concordance Avenue, Garion remembered that well. It had taken 3 days before the psychic echoes had calmed enough that he had been able to return to his work without the risk of dragging the entire planet into the warp. "I think they are recovering from their casualties and bringing in new scouts from outside the hive. The beasts are taking advantage of it, though. I have lost 2 patrols to them. I have sent Jabal and Kerian to thin their numbers." "Good. Make sure to send a copy of your brother's sketches to my quarters when he returns." Garion had been pleasantly surprised by Jabal's unexpected artistic talent, and the drawings of the former son of Horus had granted him some insight into the patterns of chaos over the last few weeks. "Ishbal, the rituals continue apace, O Great One." The voice of the archpriest was barely more than a rasp. His vocal cords had been damaged from all the screaming he had done when Garion had illuminated him, and he considered the wound a penance for his defiance and refused any healing. "Our pens are running low on stocked sacrifices, however. We are going to need resupplying before the end of the week, or we risk running out." "Unacceptable. Nrekul, are there any slaves you can spare?" There are several manufactoriums whose production isn't strictly essential," admitted the towering mutant. "If we cut the ration of painkillers given to some of the workers in half, I should be able to free a few more 100 souls. Would that be enough, priest?" "That would satisfy the needs of the shrines for another few months," nodded Ishbal. "You have my thanks for your contribution to the great work." "This isn't sustainable, though, Lord Garion," interjected Raksha. "We cannot keep sacrificing our own workforce, not if we hope to maintain our holdings in the long term." Garion's demonic features didn't allow him to raise an eyebrow, but he did not need facial expressions to convey his emotions. The very air of the room vibrated with his thoughts as they mixed with the etheric energies that formed his body. "What are you suggesting then, Raksha?" he asked. "Raiding parties," said the Forsaken Son bluntly. "I know I have already said as much several times, but while we still have hundreds of thousands of slaves we can use, sooner or later we are going to run out, or weaken our industry to the point where we are exposed to the other houses. Me and my forces need the ammunition and material supplied by these manufactoriums. Staying on the defensive is a mistake. We need to take the initiative and launch attacks of our own on the other hives, teach the houses the price of defying the Forsaken Sons." "You may have a point," conceded Garion. The Demon Prince had opposed Raksha's previous pushes for launching attacks out of a desire to avoid escalating the hostilities with the other factions of Achilles, but if the alternative was to slowly bleed his kingdom dry while he worked, well, it depended on whether he could finish his reconstruction of the Unfettered's equations before the tipping point was reached. And Garion wasn't willing to take the risk. For all he knew, it might take him years to finish his mission. Even if he hadn't completed his work by the time the Forsaken Sons returned, as long as he had demonstrably done all he could and produced some results, the Awakened One would hopefully be satisfied. Surely the prospect of usurping the gift of demonhood from the greedy hands of the ruinous powers was enough of an incentive. "Very well, Raksha," said Garion with a slow nod. "You shall have your way. Prepare a plan with what holdings you wish to attack, and what forces you will need to take with you." "I will." The wooden doors of the ballroom, which against all odds had survived this far intact, shattered with a thundering noise, interrupting the Demon Prince's next words. Dozens of intruders erupted from the entrance, clad in the typical war gear of the house forces that warred within Herengrad and across Achilles, mismatched panoplies of scavenged equipment along with newer items taken from the stockpiles meant for the Black Crusade. They moved with the speed and discipline instilled in the survivors of Achilles' bloody warfare, where mere mortals had to rely on their wits to triumph over the empowered scions of the houses. Raksha and his brothers were the first to react, moving with the preternatural speed of the Astartes. Recul was only a few heartbeats behind them. The Astartes drew their bolters, answering the volleys coming from the broken gates with their own gunfire, while charging across the room. For all the terrible strength of their guns, they were far more effective at melee range, Raksha most of all. Recul ran alongside them, sweeping his axe in front of him while drawing upon his house's mutation to infuse its blade with the power of the warp. Geryon could sense the sorcery around the attackers even as it broke apart from the unleashed violence. It had hidden them from him, let them thread inside his domain without the wards he had set up detecting them. How was this possible? Those had been the same wards he had used in his domain on Elder, their potency increased eightfold by his transfigured nature. There shouldn't be anyone on Achilles with the skills to bypass them, and yet the evidence to the contrary was opening fire on his circle of lieutenants. For a few more seconds, Geryon observed the battle. Then he leapt from the balcony, breaking apart the balustrade and landing straight in the middle of the fray. The closest mortals, attackers and allies alike, recoiled from his sudden presence, overcome by his infernal aura. He didn't give them any time to recover, and struck at a ganger holding an autogun, tearing him in half with his claws. He felt the mortal's shocked thoughts seep into the ether as his soul left his body. The man's horrified last moments fed his eldritch manifestation, and Geryon smiled, revealing a mouthful of fangs. Ritual sacrifices were all well and good, but there was something far more satisfying about inflicting pain and terror with his own hands. He turned to the next closest attackers, relishing the look of fear on their faces, and charged. Las bolts and solid slugs slammed into him, harmlessly bouncing off his demonic form. A particularly courageous, or mad, attacker lurched at him with an industrial hammer the size of a mortal man, but Geryon caught the weapon's head in one hand and crushed it to dust in his grip, before breathing out a stream of warp fire that engulfed the man's head and sent him rolling on the ground, uselessly clawing at his burning head until only a charred skull remained. Geryon laughed cruelly as he fought, letting his bestial side rise to the surface. Before his transformation, he hadn't fought in melee for decades. His old, frail human body hadn't been suited for it. But with his ascension, he had discovered that he actually enjoyed ripping his enemies apart with his bare hands. Nothing quite equaled the feeling of power that came with ending a life that way. Yet even as he reveled in the simple joy of slaughtering an inferior foe, while around him, the acolytes of his followers fought and died, he couldn't help but question how they were here, and what they were hoping to achieve. As he decapitated a mutant with a second, smaller head growing out of its left temple, Geryon caught sight of the enemy leader. He was using some kind of telekino ability to move with impossible speed across the room, dodging fire and cutting mortals apart with a chainsword. Geryon's demonic senses told him without a doubt that this sword could hurt him if he wasn't careful. It was etched with powerful runes and imbued with the energies of the warp. As he pulled another enemy apart from the inside out, Geryon kept two eyes on the enemy leader, and saw him jump up in the air to dodge a volley of bolt shells before suddenly changing angles mid-jump and fly toward Ishbal. The Kernagreek Scion raised his staff of office to block the assault, his stick-thin arms moving with unnatural strength. But the rune-marked sword cut through the staff, before burying itself into Ishbal's chest and gutting him a fish. Cries of horror and despair rose from the archpriest's entourage, with the exception of the slave that had pushed his wheelchair. That one started to laugh madly, weeping tears of joys until the killer of his master absent-mindedly decapitated him. The potency of the man's mutations spoke of a house lineage, yet Geryon didn't recognize those marks. Glowing eyes, black veins, fanged mouth, increased strength, levitation. He didn't remember any of the houses that had sent representatives to the Truthful Gate after the uprising displaying such features. Was this a base mutant, who had gained his power through the blessings of the Dark Gods, in return for ruining Geryon's plans? Besides his unnatural abilities, the mutant was strong and quick, and clearly knew his way with a sword. Many scions of the houses relied on their mutant abilities to the exclusion of everything else. House Tarodin was something of an exception in this. But this one displayed a skill with the blade Geryon knew, from having observed hundreds of explorers in his old domain, could only be obtained from years of practice alloyed with experience gained in deadly battle. More interesting than the origins of the foe, however, were those of the weapon he wielded. Sorcery on Achilles was still a stunted thing, a pale shadow of the teachings of Garian's homeworld, and less than nothing compared to the powers wielded by the Dread Coven. The chainsword was a sign of another power's presence on Achilles, and Garian couldn't tolerate not knowing about it. He strode toward the leader, and the tide of battle parted before him. The swordsman turned toward Garian, falling into a guard position. His eyes seethed with hatred as he glared at Garian, seemingly unaffected by the demon prince's infernal aura. "This is no ordinary weapon you carry, boy," he called out over the din of battle. "Who are you, to hold such a thing?" The battle seemed to flow around the two of them, both because none of the combatants wanted to interfere and because Garian willed it so. "My name is Lauk Deland," hissed the enemy leader. "Ah, yes." Now Garian remembered. Understanding dawned behind his burning eyes, and he chuckled. "A member of House Deland. I thought you were all dead. Tell me," he asked in an approximation of a conversational tone, "what are you hoping to achieve here? You must know that, even if you were to triumph, when the Forsaken Sons return, they will flay the soul from your sorry carcass for your defiance." "To the abyss with the Forsaken Sons," roared Lauk. "It was them who murdered my family and blamed it on the Inquisition. They will all pay for that, them and their lackeys." So he had figured it out. Well, it made sense that a survivor of House Deland would know the truth. While the other houses believed the Inquisition had wiped out the Deland after their true nature was discovered by an Inquisitor, the reality was much different. It was true that the leaders of House Deland had perished at the Inquisitor's hands, incinerated in an awesome pyrokinetic display amidst the melted ruins of their spires, but the rest of the house had successfully fled to the lower levels of Hive Herengrad and hidden there. But then, the agents of the Forsaken Sons had hunted them down and killed them all, making it look like the work of the Inquisition, all in order to drive the other houses to take up arms against the Imperium lest the same fate befall them as well. Garian knew this, because the Unfettered had shared it with him in between their sessions. Before the destruction of the Truthful Gate, keeping this truth under wraps had been of great importance. Now, however, the secret hardly mattered at all. The houses were too skittish, too afraid of committing to the inevitable. How long did you think you could hide your true nature? You owed the Forsaken Sons for the gifts they had bestowed upon you. All that power, and you were too afraid to use it. It was only through the Forsaken Sons' efforts that you were finally free. They played us false, snarled the mutant. They manipulated us for their own gains, but we shall not be their slaves any longer. Once you are dead, none will remain on Achilles to do their will. Foolishness, mocked Garian. Everything you are, you own to the Forsaken Sons. And they are not the kind to let debts go unpaid. All I owe them and their slaves is death, spat Lauk, before hurling himself at Garian in a burst of motion. Garian moved with preternatural speed, dodging the chainsword's blow that had been aimed for his throat, before riposting with a swipe at Lauk's head that was also avoided as the mutant pulled back, his psychic gift allowing him to completely cancel the momentum that should have shattered his skeleton to pieces. The battle between Demon Prince and Rebel Leader must have looked strange from the outside, he mused, for both combatants were doing their best to avoid being hit, Garian because of the chainsword's eldritch power, Lauk because a single blow from the Demon Prince would break him in two. It was a good effort, Garian had to admit. He could see why this Deland had survived when the rest of his house hadn't. For the first time since his battle with Alaric, Garian found himself forced to employ the fullness of his abilities. Even more so than when he had confronted his old enemy. In fact, for Alaric had been badly hurt by his fight against the Unfettered when Garian had encountered him. Garian's frustration grew as the two of them danced around each other. For all of Garian's strength and speed, Lauk was using his bloodline's talents to the fullest, displaying a level of control sharpened by the months he had spent surviving in hiding, without the resources of his house to draw upon. This was becoming embarrassing. Worse, by avoiding the blows of his foe, Garian was implying that he feared being hit, which was true, but was still an intolerable display of weakness before his lieutenants. He couldn't let this go on any longer, and if he had to make sacrifices to claim victory, well, pain wasn't something he was afraid of anymore. When Lauk struck next, Garian didn't dodge out of the way entirely, as he had for the past 20 or so exchanges. He let the teeth of the chainsword bit into his flank, and felt the ghost sensation of pain as his incarnate form was breached. For a brief moment, triumph blazed in Lauk's eyes, then Garian's hand closed around his outstretched arm, and with a single twist, the demon prince broke the limb in 3 separate places. To Lauk's credit, he didn't cry out in pain, merely anger. Not letting go of his enemy, Garian instead pulled him closer, and caught his head between the talons of his other hand. He lifted the mutant up so that he could look directly into his eyes, effortlessly resisting his attempts to use his kinetic abilities to wrench himself free. "Answer me. How did you get in here? How did you elude my wards?" Lauk remained defiantly silent, sneering as he stared into the eldritch fire of Garian's eyes. The demon prince was impressed. Lesser men had been broken by such a sight, but Lauk's hatred gave him strength. "Someone helped you get in here. Someone gave you that sword. Who, boy? Tell me, and I will let you live. You have proven your resourcefulness this day, and I am loath to waste such promise. If you swear loyalty to me, I might even make you greater than any of your family ever dreamed to be." "I will tell you nothing," the mortal replied. Garian peered into the Delan's eyes and soul, and saw that he was telling the truth. More than that, he glimpsed the subtle workings that had been buried in his psyche, guaranteeing that even the attentions of his most skilled torturers would yield nothing. "Very well." He crushed the skull of the last scion of House Deland in his fist. Gore-streaked shards of bone fell between his fingers as he opened his hand, and the headless corpse fell to the ground. Around him, the battle was finishing. The last of Lauk's troops were being cut down, a few attempting to flee at the sight of their dead leader, only to be shot in the back by Raksha and his brothers. Some of the mortals had perished, but apart from Ishbal, there hadn't been any casualties of consequence. Garian would need to find a replacement for his archpriest, and ensure that the devotion he required from his worshippers didn't diminish in the wake of Ishbal's death. Already the survivors of the priest's flock were wailing and weeping over his dead body, and Garian wondered what use he could make of a martyr. A stab of pain distracted Garian from his contemplation. Blood, or something like blood, was still dripping from the wound on his side. The floor blackened where the droplets hit as if struck by acid. That the wound hadn't already healed was worrisome. Garian glared at the chainsword where it had fallen, and crushed it under his foot. Better not to let his loyal servants arrange for it to disappear in the cleanup. With the weapon responsible destroyed, Garian focused, and stopped the bleeding, drawing more of his soul stuff from the rest of his incarnation to cover the injury. This wasn't healing, not truly. The damage was still there, merely hidden from sight. But it would suffice for now. He had more pressing matters to attend to. "They sneaked in," said Nrekal, pulling his axe out of a messily butchered corpse. "We must have missed one of the secret passages of this bloody spire." "Perhaps," replied Raksha, who was cleaning his claws from gore with a dirty curtain he had pulled from the wall. "Even so, how did they learn about it?" "Does it matter?" asked Nrekal. "Their leader was of House Deland, wasn't he?" Wisely, the mutant didn't mention Lauk's revelation of the Forsaken Son's manipulations of the houses. All it would take was one of his grandfathers getting it on with a Kernagreek daughter. That sort of thing happened all the time, even with the restrictions of the Unfettered's breeding programs, and the knowledge being passed on, just in case. "You will find out how they got in," Garian ordered Raksha in a tone that brooked no discussion. "Whatever oversight or weakness allowed this, you will correct it." "Yes," growled the Forsaken Son. He was just as furious as Garian, perhaps even more so. His temper ran a lot hotter than that of the former betrayer. The assault was also a personal insult against the Astartes' honor as the one tasked with the spire's defense. Garian had no intent of punishing him. The strange immunity to the wards the attackers had displayed was at least part of the reason why they had made it this far into the fortress. Of course, Raksha didn't need to know that. Fear, inasmuch as the Black Clawed was capable of it, was a useful motivator. The desire to expunge the dishonor would drive Raksha to relentlessly hunt for the path that the attackers had used. Whatever Raksha had been about to say would never be known, because his head suddenly turned into a red mist, along with the entire upper half of his torso. A flash moment later, the sound of heavy weaponry reached Garian, and he roared in renewed outrage, wondering if this was the second wave of the assassins, come to strike while their guard was down after dealing with their associates. That thought vanished the moment the demon prince saw the source of the attack that had killed Raksha. A gunship painted silver was visible through the broken window of the ballroom, hovering in front of the opening while painting the room with its main gun. As more of the survivors of the attack were caught in the spray of fire and obliterated, 10 armored figures leapt from the aircraft, clearing the distance easily and landing inside. They opened fire from wrist-mounted weapons as they landed, adding their own firepower to the gunships. Garion saw the gunship with the memory of mortal eyes woven around warp stuff, but it was utterly invisible to his infernal senses. This was the same veil that had shrouded the previous attackers, he realized. But how could this be? The mortal survivors of the first attack were cut down instantly. Garion saw the scribe accompanying Nrekul's party being obliterated by a shell that had missed its intended target. The shot hit the mortal in the chest, and everything above his hips simply vanished in the ensuing detonation. The mortal hadn't even had the time to notice he was dead before his soul was hurled into the warp, and the waiting claws of the Netherborn that pressed on the other side of the veil, drawn by the previous carnage. Despite their fury, Raksha's 2 surviving brothers held back from charging in melee, firing with their bolters instead. Nrekul and his 3 kinsmen were far less restrained, something in the sight of the Silver Warriors igniting the primal instinct for violence that had kept them in the service of House Kernagreek rather than carving out their own domain. 2 of them died before reaching their foe, their inhuman resilience overcome by concentrated fire. The last of Nrekul's cousins perished with a blazing spear buried in his chest, his final act being to lash out at his killer with his own blade, which met one of the knights, and shattered to pieces. Nrekul's axe was more effective. Fueled by the alchemy of the unfettered, the Taurodan mutant towered above even the Space Marines. Shells slammed into his chest, and he faltered, but did not stop as they detonated on his armor. Red blood dripped from his axe as he cut a deep rent into the forearm of one warrior. The spillage ended quickly as the warrior's wound sealed itself with preternatural speed, but the fact that these foes could be wounded at all heartened the remaining defenders. Before Nrekul could deal another blow, 2 of the knights caught him in a pincer. As he parried the blow of one, the other rammed his spear, which glowed with energies that made Garion's skin crawl, into the back of Nrekul's neck. A twist of the blade later, the horned head of Nrekul was sent flying. While the knights were occupied with the 3 meters tall horned monster in their midst, the demon prince covered the distance between him and these newest intruders. With a roar, he threw himself at the lead knight, drawing as much power into his incarnate form as he could. He struck, and his blow was repelled with a shower of blue sparks by the wards that covered the armor of his prey. He felt his hand burn, his demonic essence recoiling from the protection. No, he thought fiercely, forcing his mind away from thoughts that would, by his own nature, lead to their actualization. He would not fall here. If he died, if his was sent back to the warp, there would be no returning to the Materium for 100 years. By the time he found a way to claw his way back into reality, the Black Crusade would long be over, one way or another. He had gone too far, invested too much, to let that happen. After decades of efforts, he had finally ascended to the ranks of the gods he had once observed from afar, finally claimed for himself true power and authority. He would not let it all come to nothing here. With a scream of hatred and fury, Garion struck again at his foe, focusing all of his will and hate into the blow. This time, his claws tore through the silver ceramite, though Garion felt agony spread up his limbs, and into the flesh underneath. Spreading his arms out wide, the demon prince ripped the space marine in twain, tossing the pieces in opposing directions. More bolt shells slammed into him, each one imbued with power that was anathema to chaos. The pain was incredible, but it was just pain, and he had endured worse at the unfettered's hands. Far more dangerous than the energy infused in the ammunition were the complex spells engraved on each shell. Garion could not even begin to fathom the resources it must have cost to produce the thousands of them needed to equip a single squad of the silver-clad warriors. But as those spells sizzled and vanished as they attempted to anchor themselves to him, realization dawned on Garion. Because of his unique nature, the spells that had been designed to defeat the scions of the ruinous powers had little effect on him. The bolt shells were still explosive ammunition the size of a human fist, of course, but mortal weaponry could not slay a prince of the warp, not as long as his will remained strong. And if there was one thing about Garion Drakencraft that had remained true throughout all the many phases of his existence, it was that his will was strong. He laughed. Were those little spells of yours meant to hurt, knights? Your ignorance has betrayed you. I am the first of humanity's final form, and one day, all worthy shall rise as I have. to conquer the realms of chaos themselves. "You are a blight upon the Emperor's galaxy, and nothing more," spat one of the knights. Garion answered his defiance by plunging at him, forcing the warrior to the ground before ripping his head off. As another warrior sought to strike at his exposed back, he pulled one of the surviving cultists in the path of the blow with a thought, sacrificing the mortal to slow the attack enough that he could move out of the way. After the carnage caused by the Imperial's arrival, more soldiers were coming in, reinforcements finally responding to the Deland attack. The grey-clad Space Marines were strong, but there were thousands of troops Garion could use as meat shields while he killed the invaders one by one. It would be long, difficult, painful and above all costly, but Garion was confident that he could win this battle, through sheer attrition. A true champion of the Dark Gods might have tried to take the knights alive, to torture or even attempt to turn them. There would be much glory to be earned in the gaze of the Pantheon from the former, and Garion suspected achieving the latter would be enough even for him to earn the regard of the powers he had stolen his immortality from. But the Demon Prince was no fool, and he cared naught for what pleased the Dark Gods. "Kill them all," he shouted, his words burning into the minds of his followers and pushing them forward with renewed ferocity. "Let none of the Imperial dogs survive." His command was answered by a wordless roar of bloodlust. Amidst the battle, the 8 remaining knights were moving, silently communicating with each other even as they cut down the chaff Garion was throwing at them. They weren't giving up or attempting to retreat, not that Garion had expected them to. The gunship that had brought them down had retreated after its first volley, dancing through the polluted air as the fortress anti-air defenses tried and failed to lock onto it. One of the knights, whom Garion suspected was their leader, strode amidst the slaughter, eyes fixed on Garion even as he cut down all the mortals trying to swarm him. With a cruel chuckle, the Demon Prince moved to confront this would-be challenger. As one, 4 of the other knights moved to form a perfect square around Garion and his opponent, while the other 3 unleashed a combined blast of psychic power that cleared a space around them. Realization dawned on Garion instantly. The warriors he had killed had sacrificed themselves, deliberately putting themselves against him even though they had no chance of survival, all to bring him here, at the center of this formation. Too caught in the joy of battle and the exultation of his apparent immunity to their sorcery, he hadn't seen the trap until now, when its jaws were already closing on him. The combined psychic might of the 4 knights slammed into him, and Garion screamed. There was no cunning spell, no complex arcane formula woven into the attack, just raw, unrelenting psychic power. The Demon Prince faltered, smoke rising from him as his incarnated form began to dissolve, his mind briefly unable to hold on to it. "You cannot kill me," he forced the words out, clinging to the idea. As long as he believed it, it would be true. He pounced on the warrior in front of him, the one who had drawn him into this trap. His claws tightened around the warrior's arm. The blade found his side. The blow was weak, robbed of its strength by the claws. Garion was closing in on the warrior's shoulder. But it struck exactly where Lauk's runic sword had pierced his skin, and the psychically active blade plunged into his warp-wrought flesh. With a pulse of will, the knight ignited his weapon, power coursing from his heart to his blade through his arm in the instant before Garion ripped it out. The Demon Prince felt as if a star had been born inside him. All thoughts stopped, overcome by pain. Cracks spread across his being, and no amount of willpower would put him back together this time. Garion Drakencraft lost his hold onto corporeality, and felt himself die for the 3rd time, once as man laying inside a ritual circle in the Truthful Gate, and twice as a demon. The reality of Achilles faded away. The stones of the Kerner Greek spire disappeared into shadow and smoke, lit by the soul fires of those who dwelled within Hiveheringgrad. Garion let out a soundless scream that echoed in the nightmares of slumbering slaves all over Achilles, and caused the other never-born predators that had swarmed to the battle to retreat in fright. He had lost. He had been defeated. But this wasn't the end, he told himself. It would be decades before he could incarnate once more, but his plans did not need to go completely to ruin. He still had cultists scattered in the temples below the spire, and they were mind-broken enough that they would follow his commands even as a disembodied spirit. Surely the knights couldn't kill everyone in the city. And perhaps he could return before a century had passed. The normal laws that applied to defeated demons needn't apply to him as well, for wasn't he already the exception to a far greater rule? Yes. He could still salvage this, could still save his research and continue his work. Who knew, Perhaps working through living agents would provide some spark of inspiration that would let him succeed at last. After all, the unfettered had been mortal when he had. "Did you think it would be so easy?" whispered a voice. Garion extended his perceptions toward the source of the voice, though distance and direction meant little and less here. "Alaric Heinrich," said Garion in shock. For this was indeed who this new presence was, impossible though it may be. He recognized it, for their fates were intertwined. Alaric no longer resembled the humanoid figure of eldritch energy that had confronted Garion aboard the Truthful Gate. If not for his demonic senses recognizing the core essence of his old foe, Garion would have been ill-pressed to identify him. The former fighter of Elder now appeared as a kaleidoscope of blue mist and glass, with sparks of eldritch lightning bouncing off each facet in an endless cycle. There was nothing of the humanoid form that most never born, ascended or spawned, embraced, and Garion wondered just what had happened to Alaric to shape his essence into such an utterly alien aspect. The sorcerer in him longed to excruciate the entity to learn its secrets, even as the demon was wary of what Alaric's presence heralded. "Hello, Garion," whispered the shapeless thing that had once been a man. "I have been waiting for you." "It was you," said Garion, though of course he did not say anything, merely projected his disbelieving thoughts to the other borderless entity. "You were the one who hid the Deland and his forces from my wards, the one who kept me from sensing the night's approach." "Indeed. I guided young Lauk, whispered secret lore into his dreams that he might craft his blade, and wove the strings of fate to keep you from noticing him, as well as the warriors of silver and light. You helped them, the sworn enemies of the powers you serve? They were quite the convenient tool to finish my mission. All must play their part according to the will of the Pantheon, even those who struggle against it. But how? How can you be here? I killed you. I sensed your extinction when the Truthful Gate crashed." "My life is a closed circle," whispered the shade of Alaric in response. "When you destroyed my incarnation of crystal and fire, I was cast back through time, back to the age of woe, when the children of the anathema were set against each other in reckless hate." Images flashed in Garion's mind as Alaric spoke. The two of them were far from the men they had once been. Now they were both creatures of warp energy, living memories empowered by forces beyond mortal ken. Communication was more than an exchange of words, it was a commingling of essences, however slight, and fragments of what Alaric was referring to were passing through that link. He saw glimpses of the Horus Heresy, that mythical conflict that shaped the course of the galaxy to this day. He saw battles the Forsaken Sons muttered about when contemplating the past they claimed to have discarded. For the first time since his transfiguration, he felt how small and insignificant his deeds really were in the grand scope of things. It wasn't a pleasant feeling. "I found the one you call the Unfettered, and traded his name for the boon of preservation. And perhaps it was seeing me that first seeded the thought of mortal spirits transcending death in his mind. Would that not be ironic?" He saw a world of black seas and prairies covered in blue grass, a city burning in nuclear fire, blue armor and eyes burning with righteous fury, the glint of an executioner's blade descending for his throat. Then I waited through the fall of Horus, waited through the flight of those who would become the Forsaken Sons. I waited, as the Awakened One set in motion the ruin of my world. And when the Unfettered breathed his last, continued the Spirit, I slipped between the moment of his life and death, and returned to this world even as my younger self departed it. "Impossible," whispered Garion. "It had to be. It couldn't be that everything that had transpired on Achilles, everything that the Unfettered had sought to achieve and that he himself desired to restore, was simply part of another twisted and cruel paradox of the warp. That word means nothing to the gods. Nothing is impossible, only not permitted by them. And you, Garion, have transgressed against them." Claws of pure agony closed around Garion's essence, and he felt himself dragged away. He tried to fight back, using every ounce of his power, but Alaric had spent much longer than he as an incorporate entity. By contrast, Garion was too used to walking the materium, whether as a mortal or as an incarnate demon prince. He could not match Alaric, and was pulled under, deep into the realms of chaos. There was a great deal of pain after that, as the soul light of Achilles diminished in the distance, lost in the turbulent tides of the Sea of Souls. Time lost all meaning, and the things Garion saw would have blasted the sanity of a mortal mind 1,000 times over. But eventually, the formless tides of chaos receded, and shapes began to appear. It wasn't a place, of course, for there were no such things in the Sea of Souls. However, billions of slaves to ruin believed that such a place existed, and this was the manifestation of that idea, shaped by all these countless beliefs. Garion was on his knees, with Alaric's hands strung on his shoulders. Around them rose row upon row of seats, making it seem like they were at the bottom of some depthless pit. "This is... you know what this is." Alaric's voice was clearer now, and Garion perceived his words as just words. "It has been a while since I was here last, yet it remains the same. Which is quite ironic, when you think about it." And Garion did know. This was the Court of Change, where the servants of Zeonch gathered to plot and scheme and heed the commands of their deceitful patron. An infinite number of infinitely varied demons looked down upon Garion and Alaric, and though none of them were even remotely human, Garion felt the hunger in their gaze. "Look up," said Alaric, and Garion did, only to immediately regret it. Above them sat Zeonch itself, the chaos god of lies and sorcery. It was. The dark god of change spoke, and the still too mortal minds of Garion and Alaric translated the words of the ruinous power into the whispering of 1,000 mouths. "Garion Drakencraft," said the manifold voices of Zeonch. "The hour of your judgment is at hand." "You did not create me," roared Garion, fighting to maintain his composure in the face of the dark god's overwhelming power. Despite the utter hopelessness of his situation, he would not give it the pleasure of seeing him beg. "I was elevated by the efforts of the unfettered alone. You had no hand in my ascension. And as such, neither you nor any of the other powers can destroy me." "No," agreed the 1,000 voices. "We cannot. The laws by which we agreed to be bound in the time before time do not allow it. But we do not need to." Icy talons closed around Garion's heart, far more painful than Alaric's claws. "We can punish you, Garion," continued Zeonch. "When last you came to our realm, the Pantheon was divided as to what to do with you. But such is no longer the case. Your doom has been agreed upon by all the powers. Bargains have been made, ancient debts called due, and new ones forged. Though you were not born of me, you are mine nonetheless, Garion Drakencraft. And I shall remake you so that the changes already visited upon you shall pale before to the transformations to come, until naught remains of what the treacherous sun wrought from your mortal essence. Then and only then shall you be released, as the instrument of my will." Garion struggled, but it was in vain. Something his mind saw as a hand descended and caught him, and then it was too late. Too late to fight, too late to scream, too late to beg. The first and only unaligned demon prince was thrown into one of the god of lies' many mouths, and was silenced. The Court of Change erupted in riotous cheering, which was silenced a moment later, when the eyes of Zeonch focused on the lone figure now standing at the bottom of the pit. "Alaric, our champion, our chosen instrument. You have done well, and so we shall grant you a boon, one free of hidden blades. What do you desire?" Silence fell on the Court of Change, as the demons were stupefied by the generosity of the offer. All of them coveted the favor of Zeonch, even as they, by their nature, were driven to overthrow and replace their master. To earn such a boon from the architect of fate, they would have orchestrated the doom of sectors, sundered entire civilizations with lies and deceit, and this creature, this jumped-up mortal shade, was being offered such a gift for so paltry a task? But such were the ways of Zeonch, and though they seethed with envy, the demons didn't dare voice their protests. "We can give you the world and the stars," said Zeonch. "We can give you the eternity little Garion usurped. We can return you to life, marked as our champion. We can give you vengeance over the one who betrayed you. Her soul is here with us. What is it you desire?" "I ask for the same boon I once bestowed upon the heretic whose deeds brought us here," declared Alaric. "I ask for oblivion, great one." "So be it," said the 1,000 mouths of Zeonch. "Let it be done." And so it was, and wasn't. For Zeonch was the god of lies, and no gift it had ever bestowed had ever been straightforward. In the millennia to come, the gift of oblivion would be offered once more, to the one soul that had served the changer of ways better than any other, and even then, the architect of fate would relent at the last moment, and withdraw the gift from its unknowing recipient. A great fire descended upon Alaric, who closed the dream of eyes and waited for annihilation. The flames of Zeonch scoured his warped soul, burning memories and feelings away, until all that was left of Alaric Heinrich was a single spark of awareness. Xionch lifted that spark up, looking at it with an infinite number of eyes, and smiled, before hurling it back from whence it had come. With the defeat of their lord, the mortal cultists fled, as did the two surviving Chaos Marines. Having slain Garion Drakencraft and dealt with the threat to the Imperium foreseen by the prognosticators, the Grey Knights took their dead with them aboard their gunship, which had landed higher in the spire. Within hours, they were back aboard their ship, which had slipped in the system past the site of the Void clans occupying Achilles mining stations with ease. Less than a day later, they had left the system entirely, leaving it to fall in pieces as the War of the Houses escalated ever further. In time, the system would need to be purged, but that could be done by the Imperial forces that were even now advancing on Azeroth to liberate it from the Black Crusade. The Grey Knights were confident that their actions had dealt with any threat that might spill over from Achilles to the rest of the sector. None of them knew that, in the ruined hive city of Heringrad, something yet stirred that, had they known about it, would have concerned them greatly. In the lair of a heretic who had been called the Spider before his demise at Alaric's hands, a creature born of the dead Margus' disturbed experiments was growing. It would be many, many years before it reached adulthood, before it left its cocoon of debris and began to wander Achilles. From the realms of chaos, the spark of soul stuff that had been Alaric Heinrich plunged into the growing form of the creature and settled inside it. And on its throne of crystal and deceit, Xionch looked down upon its creation, and smiled. Azeroth Sector, Zetherian System. 745.m32. The War of Zetherian was such as poets had once imagined hell must be, back when industry had first spread across old Earth unchecked, and men had killed each other with machines rather than guns. Entire armies of mechanized mortals battled in the shadow of great behemoths of metal, spilling blood and oil on soil that had been polluted far beyond the point of recovery centuries ago. Great forges had been reconverted to produce only weaponry and other tools of war, fresh tanks emerging from the assembly lines only to be blown to pieces a few hours later. Unformed demonic spirits haunted the battlefields, seeking wounded and dying warriors from both sides of the conflict to use as vessels to incarnate in the material plane. The skies were burning, fires from the surface illuminating the clouds of smoke that covered almost the entire planet like a thick, poisonous blanket. Temperatures were freezing in places and scorching hot elsewhere, and the air was filled with toxins. An unaugmented and unprotected man would have perished in minutes just from walking the surface of Zetherian Alpha even if he had the fortune of not encountering any of the forces fighting for it. Those ancient poets would have been ill-pressed to distinguish between the armies fighting in this desolate landscape at first, until they saw the infernal icons and warp-shrouded horrors that fought beneath the banner of the chained demon head. The bulk of the forces the dark mechanicum of the Wailing Storm had committed to the Black Crusade had come here, driven both by their hatred for their old peers and by the Awakened One's command. Like all of the tech priests' domains across the Imperium, the Zetherian system had been heavily defended, ostensibly against Xenos invaders and other foes of humanity, but it was always understood that these defenses also protected the Adeptus Mechanicus' fiercely treasured independence. When the Black Crusade had begun and mechanical monstrosities had begun to emerge from Zetherian 9-6, the Mechanicus had still been confident enough to dispatch reinforcements to neighboring systems pleading for assistance. Now, the Martian tech priests had tried several times to recall these forces, but to no avail. The warp around Zetherian was burning, devouring all astropathic communication and making warp travel extremely hazardous. They had no reports on what was going on outside of Zetherian, but in the system at least, the war was not going well for the servants of the machine god. Orbital defenses hang in ruin above the Forged world, swarming with Argentian salvage crews. They had given a good account of themselves before the end. Scores of Dark Mechanicum fighters and several of their malevolent-seeming ships had been destroyed as well, their husks given over to the same scenes of carrion-like salvage. But there remained more than enough traitor vessels to blockade the system. A combination of the Forged city's potent anti-orbital defenses, void shielding, and the Argentian forces' desire to capture Zetherian's infrastructure as intact as possible had prevented orbital bombardment. Instead, the Dark Mechanicum had landed their forces on the Forged world en masse, laying siege to Forged cities already hard-pressed dealing with the monsters crawling out of the desolate ruins of Zetherian 9-6. The system's 2 moons had already fallen, their mining stations overwhelmed by a seemingly endless horde of Dark Mechanicum Skitarii warriors. The data screams of those who had been taken alive had been broadcast by the invaders across the noosphere, turning them into yet another weapon among their arsenal of scrap code and data-eater algorithms. Worse than the military situation, however, was the logistical front. Like most Forge worlds, Zetherian Alpha's vaunted independence was more proclamation than fact. The over-industrialized planet depended heavily on imports from nearby systems, supplying it with the resources needed by its voracious forges. This flow of resources had dried up completely, and while the planet had possessed sizable stockpiles in case that the vagaries of the Empyrean delayed the regular deliveries, those had been quickly eaten up by the demands of war. The Dark Mechanicum could apparently recycle its dead and their foes endlessly, harvesting corpses and metal and turning them into new cloned warriors within days. At first, the Martian defenders had ignored this, refusing to even contemplate the heresies of their foe. But as supplies dwindled and the situation worsened, the tech priests began to wonder where their enemy was drawing the considerable energy required to sustain such efforts. Dissected enemy forces, and not a few vivisected ones, revealed the heretics had somehow managed to draw anima directly from the warp itself, transforming its baleful energies into something that could power their blasphemous devices. Amidst the loyalists, the motive force required by all vessels of the machine god's glory was becoming scarce. Stocks of untainted promethium and other energy sources were diminishing. But to take in the energies of the foe was to damn oneself in the eyes of the Omnissiah. As had been the case in all wars, despair gave way to ruthlessness. The Skitarii warriors and engines dispatched to the front lines, where their life expectancy was measured in days, were commanded to feed their mechanisms from the corrupt energies of the enemy. The calculation of their masters was as simple as it was cold, since they would perish anyway, better to save the remaining pure energy for their betters, those who would survive. The outposts closest to Zetherian 9-6, though subject to the most attacks, were among the first to employ this tactic. For now, it was working, though all tech priests wondered what the long-term effects might be on those few battle constructs that, by chance or skill, survived for some time on the front lines. The doomed Skitarii were denied the right to link with the hallowed power grids of the forges, lest some of the taint they may have taken in spread, forcing them to rely only upon their ghoulish feedings to survive. The apparent deadlock would end on the day that the most powerful auspexes of Zetherian 7-4 detected a sudden and brutal disturbance in the warp in the void, characteristic of a forceful and catastrophic ship's re-entry into the materium. Haloed Fury was dying, her final moments spent in the fulfillment of her duty. The Grey Knight's frigate's journey from Beranos had been beyond difficult. The tides of the Empyrean had been spiteful in their assaults on the ship, and even the hexagrammatic wards engraved in her hull hadn't been enough to keep her safe. On several occasions, the Grey Knights had needed to purge the ship from demonic manifestations that had slipped through the flickering Geller field and the cracked wards. They had emerged from the warp at their destination, which was good. They had done so well beyond the Mandeville point, however, which was bad. The tormented hull of Haloed Fury simply broke apart, unable to withstand the strain of the contradicting forces affecting it. The gun bay was in ruins, flooded with fire and liquid madness. In order to escape, the Grey Knights would need to rely on the escape pods, the very last-ditch option, but the only one left to them. Of course, this was a Grey Knight's ship. Even the escape pods had been constructed using the best technology of the Imperium, and were protected by wards empowered by the willing sacrifice of purified psychers. Of the 26 Grey Knights aboard Haloed Fury, only half made it out. The rest died trying to navigate the ship's corridors in her final moments, or holding back debris and fire long enough for their brothers to reach the escape pods. Even the survivors didn't make it out unscathed. The escape pods shuddered and trembled as they crossed the last of the distance to Zetherian Alpha at full speed, crashing through the cloud of debris orbiting the planet. Machine spirits worked hard to hide them from the Dark Mechanicum fleet as best they could, and keep each pod in a loose formation with the others. United in psychic communion, the Grey Knights spent their power to influence the direction of their barely controlled descent, aiming their pods as close to their ultimate destination as they could manage. Like a clutch of comets, the escape pods burned through the tormented skies of the war-torn Forge world, and came to sudden and devastating stops in the wasteland between Zetherian 7-4 and 9-6. Almost immediately, the mechanized horrors of the ruined Forge city converged on their location, like vultures drawn to carrion, except, of course, that this corpse was not yet dead, and had talons of its own. In the reclaimed ruins of Zetherian 9-6, the Dark Mechanicum had built a vast complex, Half laboratory and half altar to an aspect of chaos those who were not more machine than flesh would struggle to comprehend. This monument to the eightfold Omnissiah spread for kilometers, and housed hundreds of thousands of tech thralls, all moving to the will of the former fabricator locum. At the center of it all lay the room where Kirill Meza had escaped the Forge world before the Black Crusade, passing through the Empyrean and ending up in the holds of the Forsaken Sun's fleet through the sorcery of the Coven. Dozens of machines surrounded the great wound in reality that laid there, torn open anew by sorcery. In a manner similar to the great device of Argenta Primus, they drew power from the breach, every spark of energy reinforcing the connection with the Hellforge world. When the fabricator locum had turned from his world, Paranefa, once a sorcerer of the Coven and now a chosen of Archon, had been there to welcome their ally. His Infernus dreadnought form had suitably impressed their guest, even before he had revealed to him the might of the Dark Mechanicum arrayed under him. The newest arch-heretic of Argenta Primus had taken a lot of work to turn, Paranefa would give him that. From within the Wailing Storm, the Chosen of Archon had spent months, which had translated to decades in the Materium, prior to the Black Crusade in meditative trance, his metallic body immobile while his astral form flew the currents of the Sea of Souls, past the borders of the Warp Storm. Like a tempting demons out of old Earth Smiths, Paranefa had whispered into Meza's mind. He had worked slowly, playing on the man's pride and chafing at being subject to the distant authority of Mars. He had shown him images of the wonders the Dark Mechanicum had crafted in the Iraset system, carefully deadening his horror at the sight and allowing him to feel only awe. With the lightest of touches, he had altered the logical protocols of the fabricator locum, influencing his calculations to reach the result he wanted. Truth be told, it hadn't been that much different or more difficult than manipulating a mind purely of flesh would have been. For all the Mechonicus claims of surpassing the weaknesses of humanity through the purity of the machine, the reality was much more mundane. Behind the veil of mysteries and secrecy the tech priests cloaked themselves in before the rest of the Imperium, they were still very much human at the core. Eventually, Kirill Meza had been illuminated. He had looked upon all his works, all the power at his command, and realized that despite it all, he still knew nothing. Only the trite rites of the Adeptus Mechonicus, the formulas and incantations that drove the wheels of industry. The true secrets of the universe were as hidden from him as they were from the lowest menial in his service. He might be a king in all but name, but he was still a slave kept in ignorance. The Martian Omnissiah's promise of knowledge and order was a lie meant to keep the tech priests into servitude, nothing more. It had been then that Paranefa had made open contact with his target. Zetherian 9-6 had been turned into a city of nightmares as Meza let loose his long-denied creativity, inspired by the knowledge Paranefa had granted him. Even as the Inquisition bombarded the planet, the fabricator locum had used the bloodshed as a sacrifice to tear open the veil of the Materium and open a portal that reached all the way to the Wailing Storm, letting him escape the devastation and complete his pilgrimage on Argenta Primus itself. With his illumination and teaching complete, Meza had been sent back to Zetherian, the dark magi of Argenta Primus, using the lingering connection established by his departure to reopen the warp portal between Forge worlds. Through coordination made possible by means that would have seen Paranefa executed by his old Tizcan teachers and every mention of his existence wiped out from the records of the 15th Legion before Prospero's fall, the former fabricator locum had returned to the ruins of his city at the same time Paranefa's fleet had reached the system, and the Mechonicus had found itself facing a war on two fronts. Meza would never leave Zetherian 9-6. He had, of his own free will, if any of them could be said to possess such a thing, become part of the great machine they were building there, of which the entire temple complex was merely the casing. His soul, which had been bathed in the raw energies of Argenta Primus in a lengthy and complex ritual, was forever twinned to that crack in reality through which the invasion force drew the power to sustain its engines. With Meza's completely focused on the machine, it had fallen to Paranefa to lead the martial campaign for Zetherian. The shriveled husk of his body hung in his sarcophagus, connected to the troops scattered across the Forge world through desecrated phylactic controls. Like a ghost, or a god, his mind was spread throughout the entire army. As a result, he had sensed the arrival of the new foe immediately. The Chosen of Archon had been warned of the coming of the Grey Knights. Soon after the fall of Beranos to the Imperials, and truth be told, the Unbound Lord had held longer than Paranefa had expected. The Awakened One had contacted him using the Metatron creature aboard the new Crystalline. The Lord of the Forsaken Sons had warned Paranefa that his work in Zithirian was likely to draw their attention, and that he should not, under any circumstances, underestimate them. Little was known about these mysterious warriors, even it seemed to Arkan himself, but what had been learned from the breaking of Beranos painted a grim picture. Even the timing of the Grey Knights was worrisome. Another day, even just another few hours, and they would have been too late. The temple complex would have been ready, its purpose activated, and Zithirian would have been theirs forever. But instead the Imperials had arrived with just enough time left to conceivably intervene and ruin everything. Still, Paranefa commanded legions, and only a handful of warriors could have escaped the ship that had so disastrously re-entered the Materium within the system. At his command, corrupt Skitarii moved toward the Grey Knights, numerous as a locust swarm and about as mindless. The cultivation process of the Dark Mechanicum did not bestow them any intellect. They were little more than puppets of flesh and metal, driven by the programming of their augmetic components and the whims of the occasional demons dragged into their circuits as a side effect of Argentian technology. On a one-to-one basis, they were vastly inferior to the Mechonicus' own augmented ground troops, who were equipped with the best war gear the Forge world could produce, and with the tactical input of their overseers complementing their own instincts and training. However, quantity had a quality all its own, as the old adage went, and so long as the goal had been to keep the war churning while the great work progressed, they had been more than sufficient. Now, however, with the Grey Knights approaching and the Mechonicus making one last, desperate push, the horde tactics were insufficient. Paranefa moved from host to host, spreading his consciousness across the Dark Mechanicum battle cyborgs. The creatures had almost no mind of their own, and their soul sparks were tiny and feeble sparks, easily overwhelmed by the raging inferno of his own power. Unfortunately, they were also very fragile, or at least they appeared so when faced with opposition of the Grey Knight's caliber. Whenever the Chosen of Arkan settled in a heretic Skitarii close enough to the Grey Knights to get a good look at them, it didn't last for more than a few seconds before being cut down, and Paranefa's attempts to puppet his borrowed bodies hardly helped. Within minutes of the initial contact, the Grey Knights had slaughtered hundreds of the Dark Mechanicum Skitarii. The Imperials refused to stop, refused to let themselves get bogged down. They kept moving forward, no matter the numbers arrayed against them. For all their might, their advance towards Ithirian 9-6 was still slowed down, and a quick calculation showed Paranefa that at this rate, the Knights would be too late to stop them. Unfortunately, the Grey Knights' arrival had been noticed by more than Paranefa. From the fortified outpost of Zithirian 7-4, one of the closest holdouts of the loyalist Mechonicus, came a strike force of Skitarii warriors. The Magi of 7-4 must have seen the might of the Grey Knights from afar and quite rightly believed that these warriors were the only hope of shifting the tides of the war for the Forge world before it was lost. In a move that was either pragmatism or desperation, they sent hundreds of their diminished reserves to join the Grey Knights, companies of Skitarii soldiers accompanied by a score of their remaining heavier engines. As Paranefa watched the meeting of the two Imperial groups through the optics of a downed but not yet shut down Argentian construct, he let himself hope that the Grey Knights would turn on the Loyalists. Many of them were, after all, using the same warp-born energy as the constructs of the Dark Mechanicum, and surely the Grey Knights wouldn't fail to notice that. That hope was dashed quickly as he witnessed the Grey Knights and Mechonicus forces make common cause. It appeared that, for all their claims of highest purity, the Knights were pragmatic souls at heart. No doubt they were thinking to purge the Skitarii warriors once their task was done. Paranefa could admire that kind of cold-bloodedness. Even the awakened one was wary of slaughtering his own allies, though this was more because Arkan abhorred waste than out of any moral restraint. Briefly, he considered whispering the Grey Knights' intents into the minds of their new allies, before discarding the idea. Any Skitarii would gladly lay down their existence to save their Forge world from what the Forsaken Sons had planned. Most of the time, the only way to get them to turn against the Martian Mechonicus was through their masters, who were much more susceptible to temptation. When they resumed their advance, the Space Marines acted as a force multiplicator to the Mechonicus army that followed them, dealing with the greatest threats among the foes and drawing the fire of most of the horde, which bounced off their ceramite harmlessly. Paranefa summoned more reinforcements from the forces harassing the other Forge cities, as well as from the ships in orbit. Demon engines rained from the skies of Zithirian, the Neverborn bound within them howling in pain and rage. They could sense the Grey Knight's purity, and it offended them. Tanks rolled out of Zithirian 9-6, each crewed by a singular Skitarii that had been specially vat-grown to be possessed of more wit than its numberless siblings. The ranks of damned souls clad in tainted iron marched forth to meet the advancing host, and broke upon them like waves on a cliff. Black blood and oil spilled in torrents, and the ether vibrated with the shrieks of Neverborn being hurled back into the warp after their shells of metal were destroyed. And still, the Imperials advanced, undaunted. It would have been admirable if it wasn't so infuriating. It was madness. Worse, it might be failure. The Grey Knights had taken casualties of their own since landing, but the attrition rate wasn't good enough, not with the Loyalist Skitarii added to the equation. They were going to reach the temple complex. Paranefa realized with something that wasn't quite fear, but tasted far too much like it for his liking. He had seen the empiric equations and schematics of the great work, and understood it almost as well as the renegade fabricator Locum. The consequences of any interference at this late stage, especially one caused by beings such as the Grey Knights, would be catastrophic was too weak a word. Paranefa had felt what had happened at Nereus Sanctus all the way here, on the other side of the Azeroth sector, but even that disaster would pale in comparison to what might occur if the delicate balance of eldritch powers at work here were disturbed. Very well. If the hordes of mindless constructs couldn't deal with the Grey Knights, then he would do so himself. Zetherian 9-6 was defended by more than the cloned rabble the Dark Mechanicum hurled at the Loyalist forged cities to keep them occupied. True Skitarii warriors, their augmetics handcrafted by the Dark Magi of the fleet, stood guard, along with a circle of demon engines chained at the edge of the complex, where the Neverborn trapped inside them couldn't interfere with the delicate work taking place within. But that wasn't all. As Paranefa returned his consciousness to his body and reactivated the dormant systems of his dreadnought chassis, he sent a message to those of his brothers who were on Zetherian Alpha. By the time he opened his eyes to his immediate surroundings, they were there, waiting for him. In the days that followed the alliance between the Forsaken Sons and Argenta Primus, the fabricator general of the Hellforge, Elveros Anestis, who had arrogantly claimed a title normally reserved for Mars' own overlord, had presented his new allies with one last parting gift. Found within the holdings of the renegade Haenorius had been several sets of Terminator warplate, which the Dark Magi of Argenta Primus had repaired and refitted before offering them to the Forsaken Sons. Tenoch, Uruk and the other 4 Astartes who remained by Paranefa's side had accepted the boon with enthusiasm. True, it might pale in comparison to the rest of Haenorius' assets which had been granted to the Warband, but the might of Terminator armor was something most legionary aspired to, and the Forsaken Sons' supply was small, with most being reserved for the Awakened One's own Praetorian Guard. They had taken to wearing them in almost every battle, until their old suits of armor were only worn while aboard the Crystalline, where the standard Astartes warplate was more comfortable to wear during the journeys of the Armada. Then had come the Battle of Lydius too. There, the being that called itself the Archvile hadn't gone down with any sort of grace. With its final breath, the bloated demon host had unleashed a curse that had wiped out most life on the entire hemisphere. Sealed within his dreadnought chassis, Paranefa had been untouched, but his brothers had been stricken, their Terminator armor barely keeping them alive even as the Archvile's death curse slaughtered thousands of Argentine cyborgs around them. For weeks, they had laid in the Crystalline's med bay, trapped in constant agony that made even the bite of the butcher's nails in Tenoch's skull pale in comparison. Between grunts of pain, the Fleshmaster had told Paranefa to put them out of their misery, but Paranefa had refused to give up on his brothers. Instead, he had sought the help of the Dark Magi who had once been called Omicron 193, and was now simply called Arch-Heretic Omicron. With Omicron's help, Paranefa had been able to save the other Forsaken Sons. He had turned the demonic plague ravaging their bodies into something else, sublimating its infernal essence in a ceremony that had been half sorcerous ritual, half surgical intervention. It had lasted for 9 days and 9 nights, and though Paranefa remembered only a fraction of it, the rest of his memories being lost to warp-induced fever and self-inflicted purges, it had left marks on his soul that would always be there. But when it was done, Tenoch and the other 5 Astartes had risen, alive, but changed. The fusion of their flesh and the Terminator armor they wore was the least of the alterations they had undergone. To save them, Paranefa and Omicron had essentially replaced the Archvile's plague with another, one that, in the Eye of Terror, was called the Obliterator Virus. Its origins laid somewhere in the Heresy War, with the Iron Warriors. Paranefa remembered seeing forces of that type deployed by the 4th Legion at the siege. The 6 traitor Marines had become walking arsenals, capable of mutating their own bodies into all manners of weapons, which never ran out of ammunition so long as they fed themselves on oil and plasma in sufficient quantities. It had required adjustment, to say the least, on the warriors' part. For an entire month, Paranefa had been forced to lock his brothers in one section of the ship as they vented their rage and madness on every luckless crew trapped in there with them. Eventually, they had calmed down, and resumed their position at Paranefa's side. Their capacity for violence had been increased even further, as had the Dark Mechanicum felt for them. Like Paranefa himself, they had become demigods in the eyes of the heretics, incarnations of their hateful Omnissiah's wrath. Omicron had been less than pleased with that aspect of the transformation, which might explain why he was gone now. Decades after the Battle of Lydius II, as the separate fleets of the Forsaken Sons converged before the Black Crusade, the arch-heretic had attempted to overthrow Paranefa, sending demon-possessed killers to attack his chambers and those of the Obliterators. The assassination had failed, though 2 of Eric's diminished pack had perished in the resulting confrontation. Hours of excruciation later, Omicron had confessed to the most banal of motives, the simple desire to lead the armada they had mustered back to Argenta Primus, and use it to claim the Hellforge as his own, overthrowing his old master. Paranefa had made sure to keep Omicron alive long enough to give what remained of him back to the master in question. The Chosen didn't know if Omicron lived still, but he was certain that if he did, then he surely wished he didn't. The Chosen of Archon returned to his physical surroundings to find himself in the company of 4 Obliterators. Around them were the caskets of the other heretics linked to the Skitarii hordes across Cytherian Alpha. After Omicron's attempted betrayal, they had been reduced to brains floating in life-sustaining tanks, to discourage further treachery. It was difficult to overthrow your leaders when you couldn't move, and killing you was as simple as pulling a few cables or smashing through the reinforced container holding every bit of flesh left to you. The sight of the heretics trapped within their control cradles would have been enough to drive a mortal man to catatonia. Yet it paled in comparison to the horrifying sight of the Obliterators themselves, whose bodies were constantly in flux. Gun barrels emerged from where their fingers had been, gleaming in the red light before vanishing, replaced by monomolecular sharp claws or the muzzle of a flamethrower. Their veins glowed with plasma, and their eyes were twin pits of merciless darkness that contained nothing but the promise of violent endings. Brothers, Paranefa greeted them over the Vox. Using telepathic communion had fallen out of use since their transformation. Their thoughts had become nests of razor-sharp wire that cut into his mind whenever he made contact. As you have no doubt noticed, we are under attack. The dogs of the false emperor are finally here? Asked Tenoch. The voice of the former World Eater was like the grinding of metal gears. Yes. And they are every bit as dangerous as Archon warned us they would be. At the rate they are advancing, they will be at the gates within minutes. Release the beasts and the wolves from their leashes. Drown the bastards in demon engines, growled Eric. No one would survive that. You're likely correct, replied Paranefa, but we can't risk the beasts breaking in once they are done with the foe. The work is too close to completion. True, said Tenoch. But this puts us in a difficult situation. This place wasn't designed to withstand an attack, that's why we put so much effort into keeping the Mechonicus on the back foot. I refuse to let all our work here come to naught because of a bunch of Imperial heroes coming in at the last minute. Despite the mechanized nature of his voice, Paranefa managed to infuse the name with a prodigious amount of contempt. We will meet them ourselves, and stop them or die trying. His declaration was met with a moment of silence. It was Tenoch who broke it. Well, said the Fleshmaster with what could generously be called a chuckle, but in truth sounded more like a gunshot. I know I don't intend to explain to the Awakened One how we failed in our mission. So we better get to it, eh? The Imperials breached the border of Cytherian 9-6, shattering the metal shells of the demon engines guarding that section of the edge. The Grey Knights could sense the gathering power, and they moved past the secondary temples and forges, walking on the paths through the complex that had been left open for both ritual and practical purposes. It took some discussion to convince the Skitarii, or rather their distant masters, whose link to their forces was growing more and more unreliable the closer they got to the source of Cytherian Alpha's woes, to pass the horrors in their way without destroying them. A mechanical voice boomed across the entire complex, spoken by thousands of gargoyles and station-bound servitors. Warning. Imperial forces have entered the complex. All forces proceed to intercept at once. Countdown to ignition, 27 minutes. All hail the Eightfold Omnissiah. The final battle for the fate of the Zetherian system was fought on the very steps of Maze's sanctum, near the beating, pulsating heart of the complex. There, Paranefa and his brothers stood behind hastily erected defensive positions, along with 40 of the best Skitarii warriors the Dark Mechanicum of Argenta Primus had to offer. Each of these fighters had been the recipient of unique augmentations, crafted with masterful care by the greatest heretics among the Black Crusade's fleet. In their hands they clutched weapons of absolute lethality, which they had used at the command of the Forsaken Sons time and time again during the conquest of the Wailing Storm. Some of them had died during that conquest, only to be dragged back to life by dark tech and sorcery, their corpses filled with yet more forbidden devices and brought back with great arcs of Argentian energy, their souls pulled from the claws of demons by the brute force of their master's will. As far as Paranefa could tell, such resurrections didn't seem to leave any mark upon the warriors, so lost to the Dark Mechanicum's Eightfold Omnissiah they had already been. Behind them stood one of the 8 gates leading into Maze's sanctum. This close to the Nexus, the gate only partially existed in the material universe. Its metallic surface rippled like water, shapes briefly appearing on its surface that poisoned the air around them. With his psychic sense, Paranefa could feel the waiting potential lurking within the gate, hungering for the moment it would become reality. Each of the 8 gates had been forged on Argenta Primus, and carried from the Hellforge aboard the Crystalline. There were no grand speeches, no shouted threats, as the Imperials came into view. It would have been almost impossible to hear them anyway, between the omnipresent noise of the device and its final moments before activation. Even the most secure Vox transmissions were garbled and almost unintelligible, and to use telepathy outside of the command chamber from where Paranefa had directed the war was an invitation to madness and ruin. Living weapons charged at one another, driven to violence by ingrained instincts and the will of distant and uncaring masters. Las bolts, streams of plasma and fire, solid ammunition loaded with radioactive and explosive payloads, and other, rarer forms of death hurled in the air between the two forces. Skitarii on both sides fell, spilling blood, oil, and Argentian energy in the long corridor. Paranefa added his own fire to the onslaught, unleashing the full might of his custom las cannon. The demon's head that formed the weapon's extremity came to life as power flowed through it, the Neverborn bound within the sculpted metal briefly enabled to let loose its hatred upon the universe. A beam of scarlet light cut through the battlefield, aimed at one of the Grey Knights. But the warrior dodged it, moving out of its way at the last possible moment, with reflexes no mere mortal could possess. Somehow, the knight had foreseen the attack, though his precognition hadn't saved the handful of Skitarii behind him that were caught in the beam and obliterated. After so long spent on the offensive, it felt strange to see the enemy charge at them instead. For decades, the Forsaken Sons had been the attackers, the invaders, the conquerors. Even the Black Crusade had been more of the same so far. Now they were on the defensive, protecting what they had built from those who would destroy it all. Paranefa, who had once been a legionary of the 15th Legion, didn't enjoy that reversal of fortune at all. Then the knights were among them, and there was no time left for contemplation. They were smaller and lighter than their rebel counterparts, moving with greater speed, yet their armor appeared nearly as tough as the obliterator's hide. Paranefa fought savagely, drawing upon every bit of power granted to him by the enhancements made to his frame by the Dark Mechanicum. It had been years, decades even, since he had last fought as a space marine on Paraxis, and the conquest of the Wailing Storm had given him plenty of time to become perfectly attuned to his condition. Psychic lightning crackled across his armor as he drew energy from its Argentian reservoirs, creating a shimmering shield around the adamantium plating. Up close, he was able to use his left limb. Like its right, it too had been remade by the Dark Mechanicum since his interment. Each finger of his power gauntlet was covered in sharp thorns and ended in a vicious claw marked with chaotic runes, and the flamer in the palm unleashed pure warp fire rather than burning promethium imbued with his own psychic might. Paranefa had summoned and bound the demon of Zionch used in the process himself, in order to ensure its submission. The glowing spear of a Grey Knight smashed against his torso as he bathed another in sorcerous fire, failing to penetrate the sorcerous protection. He battered the weapon away with his last cannon before catching the knight's upper torso in his gauntlet, and closing his fist. The knight's helmet came apart in his grip with a satisfying crunch, and the dreadnought threw the corpse away. A volley of bolt shells slammed into his last cannon, and he took a step back as the energies imbued within the projectiles detonated and mixed with the infernal power coursing through the weapon. The demon screeched, its essence corroded by power. Paranefa recognized, he had encountered it before, in the seraphic wards that had surrounded the imperial palace during the Siege of Terror. Anger surged within him. Why had these warriors been judged worthy of sharing in his power, when the legions of the Great Crusade had not? Why had they been told the truth that had caught the Space Marines unaware? Why were they trusted with the knowledge for which Prospero had burned? He drew on his anger, using it to fuel his power rather than letting it control him. As the Neverborn within his last cannon was destroyed, the tattered traces of its essences cast back into the Sea of Souls, he poured his fury into the husk of his damaged weapon, unleashing a final blow that bisected one of the Grey Knights, moments before the entire armament detonated. But though Paranefa fought well, it wasn't enough. He saw Uruk die with a blade in his throat, its point emerging from the back of his skull. He saw Falk and Darren, veterans who had first shed the blood of other Space Marines in the ruins of Isvan III, vanish under a swarm of Skitarii, knowing they had perished only when the piles of mechanized warriors exploded as the two obliterators' power plant, or whatever passed for one after their transformations, detonated in one final act of spite. Tenoch died last, with both his arms shaped like axes tearing through the flanks of the same Grey Knight whose spear was buried in his chest. By the time the Fleshmaster perished, Paranefa was the last defender left against 4 remaining Grey Knights. None of the Skitarii, be they Imperial or Argentine, had survived this far. Caught between warring demigods, even the Tech Priest's elite forces had stood no chance. Their bodies littered the corridor, black and gold mingled with red and chrome, with the occasional patch of silver where a Grey Knight had fallen. With one remaining limb and his armor scarred and dented, Paranefa made his last stand. But the Grey Knights were well used to acting together against single targets. They were, the chosen of Archon had come to realize, hunters of demons and sorcerers, precise instruments loosed from wherever they dwelled to take down individual of particular threat. Put more bluntly, they were executioners. Put even more bluntly, assassins. They moved to surround Paranefa, taking advantage of the hole in his defenses created by the loss of his last cannon. In a bid to reclaim the initiative, the Infernus dreadnought charged the closest Grey Knight, only for him to move out of the way of his gauntlet before cutting through the cables running through the limb's length, spilling ichor and warp lightning. The Xeontian Neverborn, sensing the weakness in its confines, immediately started to struggle. With a growl that translated to his audio speakers as the scratching of nails on chalkboard, Paranefa struggled to re-establish dominance on the demon. He succeeded, but the brief shift of focus was enough. Moving as one, 2 of the Grey Knights struck, burying their blades into the dreadnought's legs. He fell backward, his vision immediately filled by the remaining warrior, who climbed on him and buried his spear into his chest. This time, with Paranefa's focus lacking and his power all but exhausted, the weapon pierced through wards and adamantium alike, and reached the mutated remnants of the legionary's body inside the sarcophagus. Pain, true pain, blossomed in the chosen of Archon's consciousness. Countdown to ignition, 20 minutes, sounded the automated voice of the facility. Huh? So their last effort to stop the advance of the Grey Knights had only lasted 7 minutes. Despite the chronometer running in the corner of the visual feed transmitted to his brain by his dreadnought chassis confirming this, Paranefa could have sworn it had lasted much longer than that. The Grey Knight wrenched his spear from Paranefa's mechanized torso. The pain was agonizing, matched only by what Paranefa had felt when Serixithar had cut him open and left him to die on Paraxis after stealing the body of the last child of woe the sorcerer had created. Already his killer's eyes were on the gate, calculating how to break through and what little time he and his brothers had left. Then the automated announcement finished. Ignition beginning. All hail the eightfold Omnissiah. All praise his power and will. Paranefa felt the shock of his killer, and despite the pain, despite how close to death he was, he laughed. The sound that left his vox speakers resembled the tortured scream of a damned soul. With a final effort of will, forsaking all caution, he broadcast his words into the ether, making sure that the Grey Knights heard them even amidst the mayhem of the complex's activation. "Why," he wheezed, "would you possibly think we would let you hear the real countdown?" As the darkness closed in and the consequences of a lifetime of sin opened their jaws on the other side of the veil, Paranetha took comfort in the knowledge that, in the end, he had beaten the Imperium's dogs. This time, when the Emperor's executioners had come, he had not run, nor had he failed in his mission. This time, the damnation of Zithirian, when it came, was as swift as it was terrible. From the temple complex in Zithirian 9-6, a great pillar of warp fire erupted. The column of eldritch energy rose up to the heavens, and then kept on rising, past the atmosphere and into the void. Aboard the vessels of the Dark Mechanicum, whose position across the system was now revealed to owe more to ritual imperatives than strategic ones, Dark Magi chanted twisted hymns of their own while they activated what passed for their ship's Skeller engines in anticipation of what was to come. Reality cracked and burned. A great howl echoed in the minds of every living creature across the system. No mortal could look at what happened next, but had a god looked down on the entire Zithirian system from above, they would have seen something resembling a great cord of warp fire lashing around the system, before abruptly tightening and vanishing, leaving only the blackness of the void behind, while the ether rang with a sound like the mechanical laughter of the eightfold Omnissiah. Elsewhere, two suns shone together, entwined by the will of chaos expressed through the Dark Mechanicum's engine. Through the brutal opening of the minute connection between them, the Zithirian and Ariset systems had become one, both of them trapped within the wailing storm. In the material universe, such a union would have come with lethal consequences. Every world in the system would have been burned by the suddenly doubled output of solar energy it had previously received. But this was the wailing storm, where the laws of physics were slaves to the will of the dark gods. The proper entreaties and sacrifices had been made, and the will of the self-proclaimed fabricator general of Argenta Primus, Elveros Anestis, was strong enough to bend the fluid matter of the Empyrean. The only ruin this transfer would inflict upon Zithirian Alpha was that which its architects had intended. In the city of Illuria, the arch-heretic who held dominion over Argenta Primus witnessed the completion of the transfer through 1,000 eyes. He didn't smile, for he had no mouth of flesh, but he did feel pleased. As the Forsaken Sons had promised, an entire forge world had been delivered into his domain. With a thought, he sent a command to the vast fleet that orbited his world. Strikers and transports began to move, the commanders aboard them awakening from their long slumber to prepare for the conquests to come. As the loyalist tech priests looked up to the warp-torn skies, they began to realize the depths of their predicament, even if they lacked the knowledge to properly understand how doomed they were. Only the surviving Grey Knights, retreating from Zithirian 9-6, understood what had transpired. They had been forced to flee from the temple complex as it came alive around them, leering faces emerging from the walls to spit warp fire at them while the corpses of slain foes and allies alike rose once more, turned into puppets of flesh and metal for the never-born to use. Only the sons of Titan looked upon the twin suns shining amidst the madness of the wailing storm and knew what it meant. Before, they had been stranded on Zithirian Alpha because of the loss of their ship. Now, they were stranded because there was nowhere to go. Even if they seized a ship capable of warp travel, navigating a warp storm was beyond their ability. The bitter taste of failure was on their tongue as they discussed their next move, all the while moving out of Zithirian 9-6, their every step dogged by hosts of demons. In the end, though, the decision was simple. Trapped and doomed as they might be, they were Grey Knights still, and their duty remained the same. Zithirian Alpha was infested with chaotic corruption, and things were not going to get better in the long run now that the system was trapped in a warp storm. The forge cities that had remained loyal, though their loyalty had already been dubious in the eyes of Titan's sons due to the energies coursing through their Skitarii warriors, would either perish or turn soon enough. They were alone and surrounded by the foe, with no hope of escape. Their doom was certain, their death inevitable. Therefore, all that was left was to fight, and either purge the entire world of taint, or perish in the attempt. The traitors believed that they had won, and perhaps they had. But they would soon realize their mistake in thinking that the sons of Titan could ever be beaten down. This, the Grey Knights swore. Azarok Sector, Chemiro's System. 745.M32. Grandmaster Chiron of the Grey Knights pulled his spear from the twitching corpse of the thing of shadows and lies he had just killed. In the ruins of the decoy tower the Inquisition had raised on Chemiros. Pieces of foreboding black stone were scattered around him, making for treacherous footing. The terrain near the warp portal Chiron and his brothers had sealed was hideously altered, the stone having melted into the shape of grasping hands and tortured faces. The air was thick with the stench of ozone and blood, and Chiron's more esoteric senses could feel the lingering corruption. Despite the Grey Knight's victory, this was a foul place now, which would need to be forbidden and forgotten forevermore, lest the evil of the warp seep through a barrier that was forever thinned. It shouldn't be too difficult. The tower had been built in the middle of the wastes, far from civilization. But humanity had a tendency to forget such things over time, to disastrous effect. Of the 10,000 guardsmen who had accompanied the Grey Knights in the assault, slightly more than half had survived. The torn bodies of the remainder left where they had fallen to the claws of nightmares shaped like grotesque parodies of space marines. Considering what they had faced, it was an impressively low casualty rate. The survivors were already packing inside transports, to be brought directly to troop carriers in orbit, where they would be debriefed by agents of the Inquisition who would check for the most obvious signs of the corruption mortals fighting demons always risked. At least, since everyone in Azeroth knew of the existence of traitor Marines from the Forsaken Sons, they wouldn't be put to death simply for knowing that secret. There had been Inquisitors who had tried that, Chiron knew, before Abaddon's own Black Crusade had made it impossible to keep that kind of knowledge from the Imperial Guard. The revelation that Horus traitors had survived their exile into the Eye of Terror had been a harsh blow to the Imperium's morale, and the War of the Beast had put an end to lingering impressions of invincibility. Now the Forsaken Sons, who bore the colors of the Black Legion if not its insignia, had launched an attack on the Imperium from a completely new direction, which was the kind of things that gave nightmares to strategic planners. If the soldiers were lucky, they would die honorably in one of the battles to free the Azeroth sector, during which their overseers would ensure they weren't put in contact with other elements of the Imperium. If they weren't lucky, the Inquisition would pick the best of them serve in its secret wars after wiping their minds of all knowledge of the Grey Knights, and the rest would quietly vanish in the shadows of the Imperium's bureaucracy. They would be secretly executed or turned into servitors for the Inquisition's use, their records falsified to show that they had died in previous engagements. This fact brought Chiron neither joy nor sorrow, only acceptance. Not even the Lord Sector himself would be allowed to know the truth of what had taken place on his capital world. As far as the man was concerned, the source of the troubles on Chemairos had just been defeated by Imperial Guardsmen and Space Marines from the Red Hunters chapter. He would even be met by a genuine member of that chapter, to ensure the light took root. Helian's von Lextark had proven too valuable to the sector's continued stability to risk exposing him to the Grey Knight's existence and the mind-wiping protocols that would imply. Once, all of this would have disgusted Chiron. Indeed, once he had raised arms against regimes that used such methods to control their people, bringing down tyrants with fire and fury, bringing liberation to those they oppressed. But all of that had changed, and he had had even longer than the rest of his brothers to, if not accept it, then learn to live with it. For all that the Grey Knights had existed since the heresy, they had only begun to act across the galaxy in the wake of the War of the Beast, and the protocols to conceal their existence and secrets from the archenemy were still being written. Chiron had the feeling that, in the ages to come, the Grey Knights would only become more stringent in the pursuit of secrecy. He wondered what deeds would be considered necessary, and eventually become commonplace. They had already crossed so many lines in the name of survival, not even victory, just survival. None of them were heroes anymore, except by contrast, and what worth was there in a nobility that only existed because everyone else was so much worse? The Grand Master pulled himself out of his melancholy. The sight of the possessed marine he had fought here, that wretched creature cloaked in the sins of the traitor War Master, had dredged out memories best left untouched. It had been powerful, capable of shaping the demons that had emerged from the breach at the center of the ruins into warped Chaos Marines, echoes of the trauma the Horus heresy had left on the soul of mankind. These and other monsters had spawned in the ruins of the fallen tower, before spreading across Chemairos and effectively putting the hive cities under siege. Before the arrival of the Grey Knights, the Inquisition in Chemairos had been working desperately to protect the Lord Sector and maintain a semblance of order in the system. Given the scope of the Black Crusade and the disaster that had been the Battle of Silberstadt, Chiron thought that they had done well. They had kept the Lord Sector alive through 7 attempted assassinations, 3 of which they were certain had been orchestrated by the Forsaken Sons, 2 of which had been the work of unrelated cultists, and 1, against all common sense, which had been made by a political rival seeking to take the throne of Lord Sector in the middle of a Black Crusade. They had put cultists to the pyre all across the planet and hunted the monsters that had left the ruins of the tower and crossed the wastes. They had kept the factories churning out equipment for the war effort, and kept the system's infrastructure from collapsing from 100 sabotage schemes. More important to Chiron's mission in Chemairos, they had also successfully breached their own former headquarters. Of the 2 six-man teams that had made the attempt, only 2 acolytes had returned alive, but they had brought priceless information, along with the prisoner, which had provided even more. The speed with which the Imperium resorted to torture these days was another thing that made Chiron uneasy. It reminded him of a past he would rather forget. Nevertheless, it had been effective. The witch had confirmed that Asim, the sorcerer of blood and responsible for the slaughter of the Azarok conclave, had returned to the scene of his crime. Having conquered the underground fortress, the Chaos Sorcerer was now pursuing a great working that would put the entire system, and perhaps the entire sector, at risk. Despite the scale of the threat, only the Grey Knights would take part in the assault on the underground complex. Chiron had brought half of his brotherhood with him, 50 warriors clad in blessed suits of the most advanced in the Imperium, save perhaps that of the Custodes. They expected to face demons aplenty, along with the witches Asim had brought with him, not to mention the sorcerer himself, his pet Xenos and the other Forsaken Sons accompanying him. The reports from the inquisitorial agents had made it clear that bringing guardsmen along would only be throwing their lives away, and would slow down the Knights' advance besides. In fact, the only reason they had even gone to the ruins of the tower in the first place had been that the attack was going to occur no matter what. The Lord Sector had spent months gathering the forces required for such an assault. Even if those same soldiers were now doomed by what they had witnessed, Azarok couldn't afford to waste troops at the moment. Reinforcements were inbound from the rest of the Imperium, but the liberation of Beranos had delayed them considerably. And with the true goal of the Black Crusade still on the horizon, there was no telling when the worlds of the Azarok sector would be relieved. Which made dealing with the remaining threat on Chemairos even more important, for the sector's reclamation effort would suffer greatly from the system's loss. Chiron was confident they could win, no matter what the heretics threw at them. He was less confident in what would happen if the Forsaken Sons awakened that which slumbered beneath the complex. The amphitheater at the bottom of the inquisitorial fortress on Chemairos had changed a lot since the first time Asim had been there. The tiered seats where inquisitors had sat were now occupied by row upon row of mirrors, all perfectly aligned to reflect the Sorcerer of Blood's image. Asim stood on the same elevated dais on which the orator had stood when addressing the Azarok conclave, rebuilt and remade so that it could bear his weight. On the topmost tier, facing Asim, stood 8 of the most promising wits he had gathered in the Wailing Storm, channeling power from the Empyrean and into the chamber's ritual array. The wids were bound to him by oaths enforced through blood, taken on altars imbued by the might of 1,000 sacrifices. They could, technically, still turn on him. Just like Asim could, technically, walk on the surface of a sun for a period of time measurable by the Mechonicus' most precise instruments without being turned into his component particles. Each mirror had been crafted with silver melted from the furnishings of the inquisitorial suites where the former lords of the fortress had slept. The thralls of the Ordosh had provided a suitable workforce for the task, once their will and faith in the false emperor had been broken. Demonic runes had been carved into the mirrors by scholars from the Grand Library of Tesseroth, that repository of eldritch knowledge Asim had constructed in the Wailing Storm. The Sorcerer Lord had brought 11 such scholars with him when his small warband had pierced through the veil and emerged in that same amphitheater. 8 of them had died while making the mirrors. Dealing with the cruder renditions of demon speech was unforgiving work, and the slightest mistake was fatal. And even the remaining 3 had been changed. No scholar of Tesseroth could be Psychers, by decree of Asim, but the power of chaos could seep into any soul and flesh if the mind was exposed to it long enough. The results, however, had been well worth the price in Asim's opinion. Through this chamber of mirrors, he could make contact with the imprisoned, that powerful entity that had been sealed under the surface of Chemairos for millions of years, and whose bindings had been slightly set ajar by the Sorcerer Lord's first visit. That small disturbance had been enough for the imprisoned to warp the entire lower section of the fortress, briefly turning it into a hellscape that had killed the remaining inquisitors and their acolytes and left the fortress ripe for conquest by Asim's warband when they had arrived. They had put the remains of the imprisoned victims out of their misery. The screams and sights had been too disturbing for the servants of the Forsaken Sons. From its prison below, the imprisoned could reach out to the mirrors. Its infernal thoughts filtered through the reflected image of Asim. Part of the rune's function was to prevent the Herald of Blood, the demon that had haunted the Sorcerer Lord for decades, from interfering through its usual trick of replacing Asim's reflection with its own appearance. The Herald hadn't been pleased with that, though Asim was certain he had heard something approaching fear in its voice whenever they had discussed the imprisoned. "You know not what you are playing with. Some secrets should remain buried." All his efforts to extract more details from the Herald had failed. The demon had refused to speak of the imprisoned, which was both surprising, frustrating, and worrying. It had been Arkan himself who had first informed Asim of the entity's existence, having glimpsed it in the waking visions that haunted his dreamless hours. The tomes of the Grand Library of Tesseroth had contained more clues, which had eventually revealed the location of the imprisoned's jail, but still very little about its exact nature. He had brought 3 of the library's acolytes with him, their minds full of the tomes that had contained these fragments, but neither he nor the other sorcerers had managed to extract anything useful from them. They knew it was a demon, at least according to the definition of demons as entities originating from the Empyrean. They also knew that it was trapped beneath the inquisitorial tunnels, behind powerful wards that Asim's first visit had disturbed just enough to let some of its influence seep through and bring ruin to the entire inquisitorial complex above. Anything beyond that, however, was pure speculation. It took great effort to translate the imprisoned's demonic thoughts into words, even for the Sorcerer of Blood. Its mind was utterly alien, spawned by emotions and desires that had no easy equivalents in the human psyche. But, through the arcane devices of the chamber and his own ruthless training, Asim could interpret them. Right now, the imprisoned was asking what Asim wanted. It had asked that a great many times before, but that didn't make the translation any easier, because each time it phrased, for lack of a better term, its question differently. And each time, Asim sent back his reply, trying to make himself understood this time. They had been at it for 13 months, and this was the 28th exchange. As far as Asim could tell, the imprisoned wasn't trying to be difficult. It yearned to be free, released from the shackles placed upon it long ago. But the simple truth was that, just as Asim had difficulties understanding it, it too struggled to comprehend the demands of the Sorcerer of Blood. The variations in the way it asked its question were attempts at clarification, not deliberate obstruction. A bargain needed to be made before the imprisoned was released, and not just because such was Asim's mission. It would be the very height of folly to unleash a being such as the imprisoned without having first secured certain guarantees. There were many, many legends about the perils of releasing bound entities, and Asim didn't intend for his own life to become another one. A full alliance between the imprisoned and the Forsaken Sons was unlikely, and subjugation of either by the other was completely off the table. But even a conditional alliance, with the imprisoned allowed to do whatever it pleased so long as it didn't interfere with the Warband's own objectives, would be a priceless asset to the Black Crusade. At least his continued efforts had yielded more information about the nature of the wards keeping the imprisoned caged. They were of Eldar make, though of a scale and power the Xenos had lost the ability to emulate since the fall of their empire. It might seem strange that the Eldar Empire had another forgotten threat locked away in Azeroth besides the Nightmare Fleet. But 60 million years was a long, long time. Mankind hadn't sailed the stars for 1,000th of that duration, and between the Dark Age of technology and the heresy, the species had already seeded the entire Milky Way with slumbering apocalypses of its own. One needed only look at Alias, where the Word-bearers had made a weapon from the dead that the Forsaken Sons had unleashed centuries after the war for which it had been crafted had ended. How many other powers had the Eldar of old bound during their reign, Asim wondered. How many other tomb prisons laid scattered across the galaxy, their occupants waiting with deathless patience for the chance to reclaim their freedom? And what prizes might be exacted from them in return? That was what he was here to find out, on the orders of the Awakened One. The power of the imprisoned had to be bent to the purposes of the Black Crusade, one way or another, but Arkan was no fool. The Lord of the Forsaken Sons had witnessed the consequences of ill-conceived bargains with warp entities during the heresy, when the 16th Legion had drunk deep of the Dark God's Prophet Cup. The imprisoned was greater than any of the entities with which the Sons of Horus had consorted back then, though not, it was to be hoped, greater than some of the ones the War Master had dealt with, but the same principles applied. This time, Arsum had asked for the imprisoned's assistance in wiping out all Imperial resistance across Kemiros by triggering a series of demonic incursions that would drown the entire system in madness and blood. Such a blow would cripple what remained of Imperial leadership in the Azeroth sector and set back any attempt at reclaiming it for the Imperium by years, if not decades. The Sorcerer Lord had thought his terms simple enough to understand. He had asked the imprisoned to drown the worlds of this star in the Children of Ruin, but it seemed his translation still needed work. He would consult with his peers of the Coven who had accompanied him to Kemiros. He would share with them the recollection of the imprisoned's transmission. They would go over the translation together, and see if they couldn't. The pretend king is dead, plus whispered Carthago in his mind. Plus and the hole we made is closed. Plus. Arsum frowned. Aloran was a powerful secondborn, bound to a demon of rare power and ability. Of course, Aloran had always been meant as a sacrifice, a Dark Lord reigning over a court of monsters in the ruins of the Inquisition's obvious stronghold, from which he sent his minions to attack the walls of the hive cities. While all eyes were on him, Arsum and his companions could proceed with their work mostly undisturbed on the other side of the planet. It hadn't quite worked out as planned. The Azeroth Conclave hadn't forgotten the location of its own headquarters, and there had been an attempt at infiltration 3 weeks ago. But, by and large, Aloran had done his work, keeping the rest of the Imperial presence on Kemiros from launching a massed attack on the underground complex while also preventing the Imperial leadership from looking outward. He hadn't thought the slaves of the Corpse Emperor in the system had the strength to defeat the Secondborn. Which meant, plus who killed him? Plus he asked. Arsum had been the one to tear open the warp rift and lay the bindings that had compelled all Neverborn crossing it to serve Aloran, with assistance from the Herald of Blood. But it was Carthago who had infused it with enough strength to bring the entire tower down and keep it open since. She was still connected to it, and would have felt its ending. Plus soldiers in silver, plus she hissed, her thoughts bubbling with hatred, plus sparing the sigil of the eagle. Plus. So, they were here. Arkan had warned him that his dealings with the imprisoned were bound to draw the attention of the Imperium's elite witch hunters. Plus brothers, plus he reached out with his mind to the 3 sorcerers of the Coven who had accompanied him to Kemiros. Once the connection was established, he shared with them what Carthago had told him. Unless I miss my guess, we are about to be attacked. See to our defenses while I finish what we came here to do. Carthago, come to me, please. Plus. It appeared the time for subtlety was over. The ash storms that kept most of Kemiros uninhabitable were no threat to the Grey Knight's transports. A squadron of gunships descended upon the hidden entrance to the headquarters of the Azeroth Conclave, having carried the warriors from the other side of the world in just under 3 hours. The Sturmravens didn't land, merely hovering 10 meters above the ground and letting the Grey Knights jump down before rising up again, returning to low orbit. They moved with purpose, gathering in squads and advancing toward the gate leading into the underground complex. Their contacts in the local Inquisition had told them exactly where the passages were, and Chiron had selected this one as the closest from the tower's battlefield. They were careful nonetheless, for their enemy had had a long time to prepare. The first trap sprung as the vanguard reached the gate. The thick metal door, hidden under a layer of artificial stone, rippled like a pond of water struck by a pebble. A gnarled arm, covered in blue scales and ending in a 9-fingered hand with black talons, erupted from the door and seized the closest Grey Knight, its monstrous digits large enough to meet around his torso. The court warrior didn't panic as the hand tightened around him, sending cracks along his armor even as it was burned by the wards inscribed upon it. He plunged his sword into the wrist of the arm holding him, even as the rest of his squad hacked into the demonic limb with their own nemesis blades. Within a few heartbeats, they severed it, but it continued to squeeze, twitching madly, until the Grey Knights burned it to ash with a combined stream from 3 blessed flamers. The black storm suddenly redoubled in ferocity, and shapes emerged from the poisoned currents. From within the stronghold, heretic psykers were projecting their astral bodies into the storm, fashioning solid bodies out of the ash with which to attack the Grey Knights. These bodies were frail and easily broken apart, but the psykers simply constructed new ones, striking at the Grey Knights with lightning and warp fire as they did so. Chiron felt the minds of the foe around him, seeing with senses not hindered by the storms whatsoever. There were less than a score of them, each puppeteering several ash golems. 3 of them burned brighter than the other, the radiance of their souls darkened by corruption and ancient hate. Traitor Marines, he thought, accompanied by mortal witches. They couldn't defeat the Grey Knights with such paltry tricks, but they could slow them down, and that was unacceptable. Entrusting his defense to his command squad, the Grand Master gathered power inside him. His mind aligned with the pattern of a word in a long-dead language, and he slammed the butt of his spear into the ground as he unleashed both word and power. The dust where he struck was turned into glass by the heat radiating from his weapon, and immediately cracked under the impact. A psychic wave erupted from Chiron, spreading in a circle around the Grand Master. The weaker souls of the Forsaken Sun's servants were ripped from their bodies, the tie between soul and flesh sundered. Within moments, their spirits had been caught and devoured by the demonic spirits that crowded the ether, while their sorcerer overlords were forced to withdraw into their bodies. "Onward, brothers," he commanded. "The first line of defense is breached, but there will be more." The tunnel beyond the gate was large, meant to accommodate the supply carriers that replenished the stronghold stores. The other 4 passages scattered across the wastes were nowhere near as big. Of course, that meant that this tunnel, which made the best entry point for an armed force, had also been the one best defended before the underground stronghold had fallen from within. The Grey Knights had the authorization codes for every defense, but somehow Chiron doubted they would still work, more than a year after the headquarters fall. The Forsaken Sons, for all their damnation, had proven that they were no fools many times since they had revealed themselves to the Imperium. Unfortunately, time constraints prevented them from making a careful advance. Despite the vast distance, Chiron could feel the entity trapped beneath the Inquisitorial headquarters stirring. When the Grey Knights had been founded, Malcador had scoured the forbidden libraries of Terra, and arranged for the transportation of hundreds of tomes from various holdings to Titan. During the Great Crusade, this would have required absolute secrecy to avoid inflicting great damage to the imperial truth. In the midst of the Horus heresy, the slightest leak would have resulted in disaster. The war had reached Sol long before the first ships of the arch-traitor, and the horrors his agents could have unleashed with just one such cache of grimoires was almost beyond imagining. Chiron wished that they truly were such, but what he had seen during the scouring, when he and his brothers had hunted the great evils left behind by Horus' retreating legions, had opened his mind more forcefully than all the retraining he had endured during Titan's exile. When word of the Black Crusade against Azeroth had reached the Grey Knights, carried by an astropathic scream bearing markers of authority not used in 1,000 years, the chapter's archivists had gone looking through this collection of books, scrolls and data crystals. They had exhumed all of the lore related to the Azeroth sector, from the recorded dreams of seers during the Age of Strife to the reports of the armies that had conquered Azeroth during the Great Crusade and, later, freed it from the scattered war of the Great Beast. Thanks to their work, Chiron had come to Chemairos armed with knowledge of what he would find there. The Forsaken Sons couldn't be allowed to set the prisoner bound beneath the Inquisitorial headquarters free. They didn't have the firepower to destroy it if they did, not without leaving the capital world of Azeroth in ruins, and even then, there was the possibility it might escape. The Forsaken Sons knew the Grey Knights were here, as their sorceress assault had made clear, and were doubtlessly increasing their efforts to break its bonds. Given that they had worked on it for a year already, a few more hours should have made little difference, but Chiron remembered the vision his chapter master had shared with him before he had taken his warriors away from the main host of the Grey Knights. It wasn't inability that had stopped the traitor's hand before, but pragmatism, and the Grey Knights' arrival may force them to take shortcuts they would rather have avoided. Over 110 kilometers separated the Grey Knights from the Conclave's base of operations. With no mortal troops accompanying them, the warriors of Titan moved at full speed. In the past, Chiron had seen entire armies of unaugmented humans break at the sight of a force of space marines sprinting. The transhuman dread was amplified by the sheer unnaturalness of their speed, all human instincts screaming that nothing living could possibly move that fast on its own power. As he had expected, the defenses of the tunnel had been reset to ignore their idents. It seemed the Forsaken Sons had not been able to get to all of them. The Grey Knights passed destroyed gun turrets and collapsed walls, and the corpses of battle servitors whose target algorithms hadn't been subverted by the heretics. Even so, the gauntlet of automated defenses took its toll. Designed as they had been to deal with infiltrators, the defenses couldn't outright kill a Grey Knight in full armor, but they did inflict light wounds, and disabled several warriors, whose injuries made them too slow to follow the quick pace of the advance. It took the Grey Knights a little over an hour to reach the end of the tunnel, which was completely blocked by rubble. The Forsaken Sons had triggered the charges the Inquisition had put in place for precisely that purpose, and judging by the state of the rubble, they had done so long before the Grey Knights' arrival. Chiron briefly wondered if they had done the same in every tunnel, or just this one, since it was the one most likely to be used by an invading army. "Join me, brothers," he commanded. "Together, we shall clear the way to our foe's lair." The combined telekinetic power of over 200 of Grey Knights was a fearsome thing. They moved aside piles of rubble like the invisible hand of a god, melting the stone to restore some semblance of structural integrity. Within minutes, the way had been cleared. It was at that moment that a horde of demon hosts rushed through the still glowing hot passage. Alerica, who had once been anointed of the Black Tower, Lady of Tears and leader of the greatest circle of Wids on the Broken Cage, a nameless death world on which the Astra Telepathica had imprisoned the psychers harvested from the worlds of the Trebedius sector, stood in the ritual circle from which the three sorcerers were directing the defense of the underground stronghold. The Sorcerer of Blood had brought his most trusted comrades with him on this endeavor, along with the most powerful and useful of his servants. Two of them, Neferker and Yabod, shared a gene line with Arsum himself, while the third, Zarieth, still bore the emblem of the burning demon head on his left pauldron, which made an interesting contrast with the image of the chained demon head on the right one. All three of them wore armor of black and gold, warped by the years spent inside the Wailing Storm. She had never seen any of them with his helmet off, and wasn't sure any of them still could remove them at all. Few of the Wids who had departed the Broken Cage on Forsaken Sons vessels still lived. Alerica had taught many of their descendants to wield their powers, her life prolonged by the artifice of the Fleshmasters as a reward for her continued usefulness. Her own abilities had grown over time and use, her innate gift for the mind arts balanced with sorceress knowledge from the sorcerer's grimoires. Right now, she was acting as the nexus between the psychers gathered in what had been the antechamber to the Inquisitorial Gathering Hall, where the Lord Arsum was even now making the final attempt at striking a deal with the imprisoned, the terrifying creature Carthago at his side. Alerica wasn't ashamed to admit she was scared of the Xenos Psyker. Its might was immense, far surpassing even that of Lord Arsum, and its mind was weird. Broken, even. The Lady of Tears didn't know if what she sensed from the alien was what passed for normal among its kind, but she suspected it wasn't. She had never needed to use her talents in cooperation with it, and she was glad of it. The entire circle, 3 sorcerers and all 13 Wids, were bound together by her telepathy. Their thoughts passed through her and into each other, forming a sort of gestalt mind bent on keeping the Imperials at bay. She could feel that overmind, even if she wasn't directly a part of it. Lord Arsum had told her that, during the Great Crusade, before such things had been banned by the Edict of Nicaea, librarians of the Legionis Astartes had practiced a form of psychic communion enabling them to alloy their powers into something greater than the sum of its parts. What they were doing was a bastardization of that process, helped along by blood and demonic blessings. Instead of a proper merging of selves, the 3 sorcerers utterly dominated the minds of their thralls, and Alerica doubted many of them would survive as the Forsaken Sons drained them dry of power. However, she wasn't blind to how desperate the situation was. She had seen the power of the invaders firsthand, watching through Zarieth's eyes as over half of the warband was wiped out outside the gate. She had been too valuable to risk in that long-range attack, but the sheer power the leader of the enemy had displayed was terrifying. Through the overmind, she watched as the hosts of ruin were unleashed, pouring out of the tunnels in a procession of horror and warped flesh. Some of the demon hosts still bore the tattered remnants of inquisitorial uniforms, and many the simpler clothes of the indentured servants whose ancestors had worked in the hidden stronghold for generations. For their centuries of service, this had been their reward, and what remained of their souls shrieked their madness and torment from within the corrupted husks of their flesh. Other warp spawns walked without even the pretense of flesh, drawn from the ether in the fullness of their horror by the sorcerers and their thralls. Demons of Xeonch were in prominence, though all of the 4 infernal choirs were represented, as the members of the Coven called upon every pact they had made and every debt they were due to stop the Grey Knights' advance. The horde of lost and damned monsters crashed against the Silver Knights like a tidal wave of mutated flesh and infernal power. Containment circles were brought down, and yet more demon hosts emerged from hidden compartments at the flanks of the Imperials. At the prodding of the Overmind, the tunnels began to shift and twist. When the imprisoned had first stirred, its influence had spread the impossible geometries of the Empyrean through the complex. The Forsaken Sons had used rituals and sacrifices to restore order so that they could continue their work, and were now tearing those protections apart, letting loose the madness of the Sea of Souls. Corridors looped in on themselves, rooms had more entrances than they had exits, stairways led downwards to storage rooms near the top of the complex, and more than a few gates led to places completely divorced from the materium. A mortal army would have wandered this labyrinth until it died of starvation or went utterly mad, if the demons didn't get them first. Several of the previous Imperial intruders had been disposed of like this. But the knights were made of sterner stuff. They forced their will upon their surroundings, making the taint of the warp recoil from the bright fire of their souls while their ordered minds imposed sanity upon the labyrinth. The obstacles slowed them down, but they still made their way down far faster than Ilerica would have thought possible. The casualties they were taking weren't slowing them down. The warriors who were too wounded to continue were left behind, holding the line against the demon hosts before being eventually brought down by sheer numbers, though never without taking a great number down with them. Ilerica had seen the Forsaken Sons fight in the Wailing Storm. She had seen how the transhuman warriors could crush mortal armies, slaughtering them with impunity thanks to their greater strength, speed, and resilience. But these Silver Knights seemed to be to Space Marines what Space Marines were to unaugmented humans. Except that was impossible, she told herself. She was overreacting, and a closer look showed why. The warriors' weaponry and training clearly were designed to take down warp-born creatures. Against another foe, they would still be terrifying, but she suspected it wouldn't be the same sort of all but one-sided carnage that was taking place. Unfortunately, demons were the only thing between her and the silver-clad killers. That did not bode well. In the end, it took less than 2 hours for the Silver Knights to make their way through defenses that had taken months to prepare. By that time, Ilerica could feel the unease radiating from the sorcerers directing the Overmind, and the utter terror of the woods. The knights had wandered across the labyrinth, but they had always sought to go down, towards the section of the complex formerly reserved to the Inquisitors themselves, which now served as the chambers of the Forsaken Sons and the very ritual room in which they all stood. Only one path led to the ritual chamber, right in front of the massive gates leading to the amphitheater at the bottom of the complex. The knights ran down it, even as the Overmind broke apart as the sorcerers returned their astral forms to their bodies and prepared to fight for their lives. The knights' leader was at the forefront of their host. Ilerica didn't know their heraldry, but that this one was in charge would have been obvious even to someone without her supernatural talents. His skin was corpse white, and his eyes were 2 orbs of perfect obsidian. The blade of his spear shone with power, but it paled compared to the might she felt emanating from the warrior himself. Ilerica had witnessed many things since joining the Forsaken Sons. She had beheld the horrors of the Wailing Storm, the myriad forms of demonkind and the twisted cultures mankind had developed under their influence. Yet nothing had ever scared her like that warlord did. She felt certain, without knowing how, that this warrior, all of the Silver Knights, but this warrior especially, was anathema to her and her kind, his body, mind and soul shaped by a great and terrible power to hunt and destroy them. She struck at him with all her strength, focusing her power into a needle of psychic energy aimed at his mind. She had broken kings and generals with that attack before, and even the trained servants of the Inquisition hadn't been able to keep her out when she had helped the interrogation of the captives taken in the initial attack on the complex. Her attack smashed against the knight's mental defenses without making the slightest dent. She wasn't just facing his own defenses, Ilerica realized. The knights were mind-linked to one another, like the Wids and sorcerers had been, though the Overmind had broken down the moment battle had been joined on the physical plane. She tried again, and again, pouring more and more power into each desperate attack. If she could take down their leader, perhaps the backlash of their joining sundering would be enough to give them the upper hand. It was a slight hope, but it was better than waiting to die. On the 4th attempt in as many heartbeats, she sensed the slightest crack form in the warrior's barrier. She focused her power and will, ready to attack at the weak spot she had created, but he turned his gaze upon her, having identified the source of the psychic attack. Before she could react, he moved across the battlefield, dodging every other assault that came his way, and struck. The spear pierced through her genetic shield and ran through her chest. In the instant she stood transfixed, before death claimed her, Elerica saw the wards and runes that covered the knight's armor and weaponry with perfect clarity. With the insight of one caught on the brink of death, she realized that all of them had been empowered by sacrificing psykers, imbuing their lives and spirits into the objects after extensive purification rituals, or, as she and the sorcerers of the Coven would both have called it, mind-breaking torture. Was this what the Imperium had wrought from the psykers taken by the Black Ships? Would this have been her fate too, if the Awakened One hadn't unleashed the wailing storm and cut off forlorn hope from the Imperium? Slain to arm her oppressors, or burned like kindling in the Astronomican's great engine of agony? Despite the pain, she felt a flash of horror-tinged gratitude to have at least been able to live her life somewhat on her own terms, before her body gave in to the inevitable. The reinforced doors to the amphitheater blew open. Projecting a facade of calm, both in his body language and in his surface thoughts, Asim turned to face the intruders. His attempt to contact the imprisoned again with Carthago's assistance had worked, but the entity remained furiously unable to understand them. He had risked damaging the conduit with the intensity of their repeated exchanges, half of his assistants had perished in the attempts, and his left leg felt as if it had turned to stone. And it had all been for nothing. The Imperial Space Marines erupted in the chamber, spreading on the uppermost tier and plunging their strange weapons into the wids. Asim had read Malone's report on the witch hunter's capabilities, but seeing them in action was something else entirely. They were especially effective against demonkind, he knew, and were also masterfully crafted power weapons that cut through the mortal's mutated flesh with ease. As the knights slaughtered his circle of assistants, they sent the mirrors close to them flying, and the chamber was filled with the sound of breaking silver and the stench of ozone as the energies that had flowed in complex patterns were violently disturbed. With an effort of will, Asim redirected the backlash into the second tier, absently watching as the entire row of mirrors on that tier also detonated. Silvery fragments kept spinning in the air as they were caught in streams of warp energy. The support beam of Asim's dais was broken, and the Sorcerer Lord waved his hand, quickly weaving a spell to keep the small platform from collapsing. Ironically, he couldn't use the way by which he had been banished from this place during his first visit to escape. His own work here had altered the fundamental esoteric properties of the location, making sorcerer's travel extremely hazardous. He could only hope that, after the damage the knights had already suffered, his power, and, more realistically, Carthago's, would be enough to deal with them. The alien child, he could still only think of her as a child. She hadn't grown up at all in the years she had spent at his side. Her body, preserved by her sheer alpha psychic power, was standing at his side, head cocked as she looked at the Silver Knights without any trace of fear. As the last of the wids fell and the knights turned their weapons toward him, Asim and Carthago weaved their power together, erecting a kinetic barrier around the two of them. As they did, he saw the one who could only be the knight's leader enter. His power burned Asim's second sight with its intensity, so bright that the sorcerer could barely see in the ornate armor that covered the warrior's physical form. A name was written in golden letters on the warrior's chest plate, Chiron. His face was bare, and to his shock, Asim recognized it, though it had changed, altered by gene forging beyond that of a typical space marine. The eyes were still the same, twin pits of blackness, typical of the 8th Legion's gene line, though seeing them on a grey knight felt jarring to say the least. Despite his situation, surrounded by Imperial elite killers atop the prison of an ancient demon lord, with only Carthago for backup and no way of escape, curiosity overcame Asim. It had long been the flaw of his lineage, and despite everything he had done and become since breaking his ties to the 15th Legion, the Sorcerer Lord still was Magnus the Red Sun. He extended a cautious mental probe toward the Knightly Lord, not to attack, but to establish communication. To his surprise, he felt the other psycho respond, and a tentative link establish itself. The Sorcerer of Blood's perception of time slowed down to the point he could see individual bolt shells move slowly through the air, and he began to speak, mind to mind, to the one who had come to kill him. Telepathy was a much more efficient method of communication than spoken words, after all. Plus I know you, he sent, his thoughts expressing the theory that had blossomed inside his mind at the sight of the warrior's face. Plus Chief Librarian Fels Herost of the Night Lords. It has been many years. Plus the psychic imprint of the answer was so different that for a moment Asim thought he had been mistaken, but its contents quickly confirmed he hadn't. Plus so it is you, Asim. I thought it might be when I heard your name from those who last broke into your stolen domain. Indeed, it has been many years, not since the compliance of Vrakish. But I ceased being the chief librarian of the Eighth long before it even turned its own blades upon that cesspit it called home, and I am Fels Herost no longer. The Emperor burned away that name when he remade me, so that it couldn't be used against me. Asim stared at him in absolute shock. That Fels Herost hadn't been part of the Night Lord's Legion when it had destroyed Nostromo wasn't surprising. Like the rest of the legions, the Sorcerer of Blood had thought the chief librarian to have been executed, either by the Night Haunter or one of his lackeys, after the Edict of Nicaea had forbidden the use of psychic powers among the Legiones Astartes. The other legions had reintegrated their librarians into the ranks of Battle Brothers, except the Imperial Fists, for some stupid reason only someone like Dawn could have conceived, but no one had been surprised when the Night Lords had instead purged them in blood. Even back then, they had been a disreputable legion. That Fels Herost had changed his name wasn't surprising either. Indeed, Asim would have been surprised if the other Psyker had still used the same. The Imperium had tried very hard to pretend the heresy had never happened, and a survivor from one of the traitor legions would have been awkward to explain. But that wasn't what the Grey Knight was talking about. Names were not so important to Psykers as they were to demons, of course, but they were still core pillars of their identity, from which they derived much of their power. Knowing the name of an enemy practitioner was a key advantage in any sorceress contest, and any seer worth the name could use it to glean precious information from the ether. To have it removed, he didn't doubt the false emperor could have done it before his entombment in the Golden Throne, but the consequences of such a thing would be, "He mutilated you," hissed the Sorcerer of Blood, "and yet still you serve him?" Plus I volunteered. We all did. We understood what was at stake, and that the treachery of you and your kind left him no choice. A weapon was needed to deal with the consequences of your folly. And you would know much of folly, wouldn't you, Asim of the 15th Legion? Those of us who were chosen by Malcador owe you a debt of blood for your deeds at Terra. You killed a hero of humanity there. Plus yes, I did. I faced one of the Sigilites 12, and for all his learning and power, I killed him. But you weren't there, Chiron, plus replied the sorcerer. Plus none of you gilded knights were, even as the fate of the galaxy was decided in that crucible of war. That mortal might have survived, if you had been. Plus true. We were not. Our duty demanded something else from us. But we remember, Asim. Of all the Imperium, we alone remember the full horror of the siege and the war which murdered the dream of the Great Crusade. They have forgotten, or been made to forget. Even the ones who ruled here before you killed them aren't allowed to know the full truth. But we do. Plus the Great Crusade's dream was always a lie, plus scoffed Asim. Plus you, of all people, should know that. How many worlds did your legion bring to the fold of the Imperium through torture and terror, with the Emperor's own blessing? We were always monsters. Horus simply made us face and accept that reality. Plus no. You and your kind chose to be monsters. Monsters? What do you know of monsters, servant of the Empire? Hissed Carthago through the link, her voice full of the terrible wrath she carried inside of her. I see you, Butcher. I see the ashen ruins you left in your wake. I see the devastation you made and called empire. I see the lies you tell yourself to justify it all, and I know it to be dust. Judgment comes for you now, and you will die. The communication ended, sundered by the raw power and hate of the alien Psyker. From the moment Asim had initiated contact to its end, it had barely lasted a single heartbeat in the world of flesh. Carthago unfurled from Asim's back, her eyes blazing with witch fire. Fels Herost, no, Asim corrected himself. Chiron, thinking of him as he had once been would be a dangerous mistake, slammed his spear into the ground before him. Carthago struck while still maintaining the barrier, splitting her attention between two tasks that would individually have drained a weaker Psyker in seconds. But the Grand Master had brought up his own protection in time, and the kinetic blows that would have ruptured ceramite armor like kindling instead smashed against an invisible shield. Words of power emblazoned on the armor of every knight flared, as together they held the wrath of Carthago at bay. Every single knight was a Psyker. Asim had known this would be the case, but to see it in action was still jarring. His former legion had been humiliated for relying on psychic abilities to win war, and here was the utmost elite of the Imperium going even further, since not even Prospero had been able to fill the ranks of the 15th with only psychers. Together, Arsum and Carthago battled the assembled knights, laying waste to the amphitheater in the process. They shattered the tiered seats and broke the silver mirrors into thousands of pieces that flew around in arcane patterns, crackling with the psychic equivalent of static energy. They superheated the air and dragged pieces of rock from the walls to hurl at their foes, all while maintaining the kinetic barrier around them while hundreds of blessed bolt shells slammed into it. It wasn't enough, Arsum realized with grim acceptance. Carthago was powerful beyond reckoning, even if she hadn't learned to use her full power, or perhaps she couldn't. The Sorcerer of Blood had long suspected that the Dark Gods would not allow her, or indeed any psyker of her level, to fully master their potential. But the Grey Knights were witch hunters, designed by the Imperium to kill her kind as much as demons. The wards of their armor were turning aside her attacks, and their ammunition was slowly but surely burning their way through her shield. In one of the floating silver shards, Arsum caught sight of the Herald of Blood. The demon that had haunted him for decades stared back at him with a strangely solemn expression. It did not speak into his mind this time, did not offer any way out that would come at great cost, either to Arsum or to someone else. Perhaps it couldn't see a way out of this situation, or perhaps it judged that the Sorcerer Lord's usefulness to whatever game it was playing had run out. Even after all this time with it as a constant companion, Arsum couldn't claim to understand the infernal mind of the Cornate Neverborn. If he was going to fail and die, then by the Dark Gods and all their nameless legions, he wouldn't die alone. The Sorcerer of Blood opened his mind to the currents of chaos, preparing to draw upon all the power he could handle and more, determined that he would slay Chiron and cost the Imperium one of its last champions from the Great Crusade. Drawn by his spite and his hatred, the ruinous powers answered, and he felt himself swell with power such as he had only felt once before, when he had transported a world's worth of sinners and criminals through the Empyrean. As he held that power and was about to strike, knowing that to do so would destroy him utterly, time seemed to stop. His perceptions were dilated by the power he clutched to his soul, and for the first time, he sensed the true nature and might of the imprisoned. It was immense, greater than any singular warp entity the Sorcerer Lord had ever encountered in his long life. It was greater than Serexithar, greater even than his former Lord Magnus, after the Crimson King had abandoned the last trappings of mortality during the Siege of Terror. And it was bound, held in place not quite beneath Chimera's surface but in some sort of adjacent realm, a prison that kept it barely in touch with reality without letting it escape to the immaterium either. In that timeless moment, it looked back at him, and spoke in a voice that shook what remained of Arsum's soul. "This is my bargain. There will be no other. Your life for my freedom." He had been tricked, Arsum realized. All this time, the imprisoned had been pretending to be unable to communicate clearly. It had waited for this, for a shift in the situation that would give strength to its bargaining position. Out of sheer spite, Arsum was tempted to simply die fighting. To reject the imprisoned's offer, condemning it to an eternity trapped in its ancient prison. His task on Chemairos, given to him by Archon, had been to arrange the imprisoned's liberation to inflict as much damage as possible to the Imperium. With no bargain to direct its actions, there was no telling what the fallen Demon King would do. But, whatever it did was unlikely to benefit the Imperium. "Plus I accept your bargain, plus he sent back, and rammed his full power into the weak spot of the seals through which he and the imprisoned had been talking for months. All of the power he had drawn into himself vanished, gone as if it had never been there, consumed to break the seal. It didn't kill Arsum as he had half expected it to. Bargain or no bargain, he knew enough about deals with Neverborn to expect treachery, especially in such a blind and desperate pact. But the power's consumption was too total, too absolute, for there to be anything left that could fuel his own demise. He felt his blood run cold, his heart go slow and his muscles turn to lead as most of his life force was siphoned away, but he didn't perish. In the distance, he thought he heard something like the Dark Gods snarl at being denied the spectacle they had anticipated his final stand to be. "No!" Arsum heard Chiron shout as the Grey Knight who had been a Night Lord felt what was happening. The power of the Grand Master fell upon the seal, his shining energy seeping into the damaged spell to try and repair it. He might have succeeded, for Arsum's strength was utterly spent. It was all he could do to stand, and not fall to the ground. But Carthago seized upon the distraction. Badly wounded though she was, her hatred gave her strength. She plunged her thin arms, wreathed in sorcerous lightning, into the Grey Knight's chest, burying them all the way to her shoulders, until her snarling face was pressed against Tyron's armor. Dilendo Imperium, she shouted into the minds of all who could hear her. Then she burned, as that ancient city had burned, as her birth world had burned. And for all his power, all his armor and all his emperor-given blessings, Chiron burned with her. Arsum didn't have time to enjoy this victory or mourn that sacrifice. The other Grey Knights were still there, their aura flaring with the drive to avenge their Grand Master. The barrels of 20 wrist-mounted bolters turned towards him, and the seal broke. The being that had been called, in a flawed and incomplete Low Gothic translation of the original name, which had been spoken in a now extinct language, Devourer of Heartstream, in the age before the children of Aisha had wiped out its followers and bound its power beneath the crust of their world, did not roar in celebration at its freedom, for it felt no joy in it. It felt no joy in anything. That was its nature. Its people had been grim creatures, who had believed that one must never speak one's hopes or dreams aloud, lest one draw the devourer's attention. It was a spirit of misfortune and dread, of the terror that comes with the thought of failure and the destruction of everything you knew and loved. Its priests had worshipped it, making sacrifices upon its altars to turn its wrath away from them and unto their enemies. It had grown strong, feeding upon the dreams of kingdoms, plunging them into misery and hopelessness. Strong enough that, when the witches of the Eldar Empire had come, drawn by visions of a nascent power to join the great game, they hadn't been able to eliminate it. Instead, they had bound it, using knowledge accumulated over the eons of their long war against the primordial annihilator. In that moment, it had stopped being Devourer of Heartstream, and become the imprisoned. From within its prison, it had watched as the galaxy turned. It had seen the fall of the Eldar, and found no joy in it, not even satisfaction, unable as it was to feed upon the destruction of 1 trillion dreams at once. It had seen the young race of humanity come to the dead world of its people and remake it into something that could sustain them. It had heard the echoes of the great war that had torn their empire asunder, quickly followed, as the imprisoned reckon time, at least, by the roar of the beast. So much destruction. So much despair. It had been like a feast being laid out just beyond the reach of a man fighting against starvation. Scraps of it had fallen through its cage, however, for the passing of eons had eroded its walls ever so slightly. It had devoured them, briefly regaining its original name, and sought to use that trickle of power to influence those inhabiting its world prison into freeing it. It hadn't worked, though it lacked the perceptions to understand how, and the sight of its followers' attempts to reach into its cage, where the Eldar witches had gathered to bind it long ago, had become the home of those who had slaughtered them. It hadn't despaired, for it couldn't. Its people had conceived it as a relentless force, one that never paused its efforts to bring about the destruction of their dreams, and its nature remained shaped by their perceptions, though they had been dead for millions of years. It could feel the ascendancy of ruin beyond its cage, and knew that soon, its hour would come. And it had. The spark had made bargain with it. It could have been freed sooner, but the notion of being bound to another's goals was abhorrent to it. It had waited, biding its time, for what were a few months to one such as it? And in the meantime, it had learned much of the little spark, while pretending not to. Deceit was in its nature. How many times had its people thought they had eluded its attention, or managed to trick it, before it brought their entire lives down? But the bargain held true. The spark, for all its insignificance, had knowledge kin to the Eldar witches that had bound it. It was bound by the bargain, and only when that bargain was fulfilled would it stop being the imprisoned. It reached out and caught the spark, sensing the ties that bound it to other sparks in the materium. One of these burned brightest, an ally, an object of fear, a master. It hurled the spark that way, and the final shackle of the imprisoned fell away as it completed its bargain. At last, Devourer of Heartstream was free. It considered the world of its people, and the other objects that orbited its star. There was much strife here, many souls working to keep ruin at bay. It could feed upon them, in a way it had not feasted since the slaughter of its people. But then, Devourer of Heartstream shivered. It was seen. Predators greater than it, if perhaps not older, were taking notice of its existence now that it was no longer hidden behind the walls of its prison. It fled. It plunged into the sea of souls, past the surface where the hosts of ruin gathered and watched the materium with ever-hungry eyes, and into the depths where other ancient leviathans of the warp endured beyond the gaze of the gods. All across Chemairos, sleepers dreamt of broken chains and great, burning maws, before waking up in sweat and with their hearts racing. In the Inquisitorial stronghold, the Grey Knights barely managed to bring the charred corpse of Grandmaster Chiron out before the entire underground complex collapsed. They looked up at the sky and, finding it not burning, reasoned that this was not defeat, but it certainly wasn't victory either.